When I first found the house, it didn't feel like a place that would hide anything. It looked ordinary in the way old things sometimes do, worn, familiar, as if it had been waiting for someone to come back. The kind of house that made you think of quiet afternoons and the smell of dust in sunlight. I told myself it was the kind of place a person could start over. I moved in on a rainy afternoon, the kind where the sky is a dull gray and the air feels heavy against your skin. The moving truck arrived, the driver barely speaking. He nodded, dropped the boxes, and left before I could even offer him a bottle of water. I remember standing in the doorway, watching the rain run down the windows, thinking about how quiet it was. No neighbors waved, no children played, no dogs barked, just the sound of rain and the soft creak of the old porch beneath my feet. Inside, the house smelled like old wood and stale air. It wasn't unpleasant. It was more like the scent of something that had been closed up for too long. The floors creaked under my weight, and the walls seemed to lean in a little, like they were listening. I had bought the place cheap, the kind of deal that makes you suspicious, even when you're desperate. A house like this in this neighborhood should have been worth more. But the previous owner had died, and no one had lived here since. The real estate agent had said it was a fixer-upper, and she had smiled in that way people smile when they don't want to admit something is wrong. I told myself I wasn't scared. I told myself I was just tired. I'd been living in a cramped apartment for years, and the idea of space felt like a relief. A house with a basement, a yard, and a place to breathe. That first night, I slept like a stone. I woke up early before dawn to the sound of something shifting downstairs. I lay still, listening, waiting for it to stop. When it didn't, I told myself it was just the house settling. Old houses do that. They make noises. That's normal. But the sound wasn't like the house settling. It was more like a soft scrape, like someone dragging a chair across the floor. It came from below, from the basement. I didn't go down, not at first. I sat in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The rain was still falling outside, steady and calm. The house was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as if it was holding its breath. Eventually, I got up. I needed coffee. I needed something normal. I walked through the kitchen, still half asleep, and noticed the light in the hallway flicker, just once. Then it stayed steady again. I made coffee and tried to focus on the small, ordinary tasks that make a new place feel like a home. I unpacked boxes. I hung a few pictures. I cleaned the bathroom. I told myself I was just being paranoid. But the basement door kept calling to me, in the quiet way that some sounds do when you try not to listen. It was at the end of the hallway, tucked behind a narrow closet. The door itself looked old, heavy, and plain. It didn't have a window, and it didn't have any decorations. Just a simple, wooden door with a brass knob that had dulled with age. I didn't remember seeing the basement when I first toured the house. I must have, but I didn't notice. I had been too focused on the main rooms, the living space, the kitchen, the bedroom. I'd been thinking about how I could paint the walls, how I could make it my own. Now, standing in front of that door, I felt a strange sense of unease. Like I was being watched by something that didn't want me to go down there. I told myself again that I was being silly. It was just a basement. It was just a part of the house. It was just a place to store old boxes and tools. Still, I hesitated. I put my hand on the doorknob and it was cold. Not just cool, but cold like the air in a refrigerator. The kind of cold that makes your skin tight. I turned the knob. The door opened with a soft groan, like the house was letting out a breath it had been holding for years. The basement smelled stronger than the rest of the house. Damp wood, mold, something else too, something metallic and old. It hit me in the chest, and I had to take a slow breath to keep from gagging. The stairs were steep, and the light at the bottom was dim. There was a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, swinging slightly. It cast long shadows that stretched across the concrete floor. I took the first step down, then another, slowly. The air got colder with each step. It felt like I was descending into a different world. At the bottom, I turned on the light. The basement was empty mostly. Just a few old boxes stacked against the walls, and a workbench with tools that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. There was a faint layer of dust over everything, except for a small area near the far wall, where the floor looked clean, like someone had been there recently. That was when I saw it. A for sale sign. It was leaning against the far wall, the kind of sign you see on lawns. It had the realtor's name on it, the same one who had sold me the house, the same one who had smiled and said, "It's a wonderful property." The sign was old, the paint was faded, but the letters were still clear, as if someone had painted them yesterday. And it wasn't just any for sale sign. It was the kind that you only see outside a house, not inside a basement, not hidden away, not abandoned like this. I stared at it for a long time, and my mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe the previous owner had left it. Maybe it had fallen off the front lawn and ended up here. Maybe it was just a strange coincidence. But the sign wasn't dirty. It wasn't dusty. It looked almost new, like someone had put it here recently on purpose. My heart started to beat faster. I walked closer. The sign leaned at a slight angle, as if someone had placed it there and then stepped back. The words were simple. For sale. Underneath, in smaller letters, was the realtor's number. I reached out and touched the sign. The paint felt smooth, almost fresh. The edges of the board were sharp, not worn. It didn't feel like it had been left here for years. It felt like it had been placed here yesterday. I pulled the sign away from the wall. On the back, written in black marker, was a note. It was in neat handwriting, the kind of handwriting you might see on a school project or a grocery list. It said, "Don't let them see you." My skin went cold. I dropped the sign and stepped back, my mind trying to scramble for explanations. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone had broken into the house. Maybe the realtor was messing with me. Maybe I was just tired. But the words stayed in my head, simple and clear. Don't let them see you. I looked around the basement, as if expecting to see someone hiding in the shadows. There was no one, just the empty space, the old boxes, and the quiet hum of the house above me. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run upstairs and lock the door and pretend none of this had happened. But I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where the sign had been. The silence felt thick, like it had weight. Then from somewhere above me, I heard a sound. Not a footstep, not a voice, just a soft, gentle click. Like a door closing. And for the first time since I moved in, I felt truly alone. After I found the sign, I tried to go about my day like nothing had happened. I told myself it was just a weird moment, something I would laugh about later. I made coffee. I unpacked more boxes. I even tried to clean the basement, like I could scrub away the feeling that had settled in my chest. But every time I looked at the basement door, I felt the same pull, the same quiet pressure, like the house was calling me back. That evening, I went downstairs again. I told myself I was just checking for water damage, just making sure everything was safe, just doing the responsible thing. The light at the bottom of the stairs was dim again, and the air was colder than before. The bulb swung slightly, as if it had been moved by a breath. I turned the light on and walked toward the far wall where the sign had been. The sign was gone. I stood there for a moment, confused. I had been sure it was leaning against the wall. I had been sure I had seen it. I had been sure I had touched it. But the space where it had been was empty. The concrete floor was just concrete. No sign, no mark, no evidence that anything had ever been there. I felt my heart tighten. I looked around the basement, searching for the sign. I searched under the workbench, behind the boxes, in the corners. I didn't want to believe it, but my mind started to whisper the worst thought. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was losing my grip on reality. I shook my head and forced myself to breathe. I told myself to stay calm. I told myself to be practical. Then I saw the door. It wasn't the basement door. It was another door tucked into the far corner of the basement. I hadn't noticed it before. It was old like the rest of the house, but it had a different feel to it. It looked newer, as if it had been added later. The door was painted a dull gray. It had no handle, just a small brass keyhole in the center. The keyhole looked ornate, like something from a different century. The metal was tarnished, but the design was still visible. A small floral pattern around the hole, like it was meant to be decorative. I didn't remember seeing this door when I first came down. I didn't remember any door here at all. And yet, standing in front of it, I felt an odd sense of familiarity, like I had seen it in a dream. I reached out slowly, my hand hovering near the door. The air around it felt different, not colder exactly, more like it had weight, like the space around the door was thicker, as if the air itself was holding something back. My fingers touched the wood. The moment I made contact, the air changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the way the basement felt. The light seemed dimmer. The shadows grew longer, even though the bulb hadn't moved. The sound of the house above me faded, like the walls had absorbed it. I felt a small, involuntary shiver run down my spine. I pulled my hand back, but the feeling stayed. The door seemed to hum quietly, like a distant vibration you can feel more than hear. I looked at the keyhole again. It was too small for any modern key. It looked like it belonged to a tiny, old-fashioned key, the kind you might find on a necklace or in a museum. A key that was meant for a small, private place. I pressed my forehead against the door just for a moment, like I could listen through the wood. I didn't hear anything. No voices, no movement, nothing. But I felt it. A sense of being watched from the other side. I stepped back, trying to make sense of it. The rational part of my mind tried to explain it away. Old houses are strange. Basements are creepy. I was tired. Stress makes you feel things that aren't real. But the feeling didn't leave. It stayed like a weight in the air. I turned around and looked at the basement. The boxes, the workbench, the bare walls. Everything seemed normal. The only thing that felt wrong was that door. I had the sudden urge to leave. To go upstairs, lock the basement door, and pretend I had never seen it. But curiosity, that quiet, dangerous kind, kept me rooted. I walked closer again. I stared at the keyhole. I wondered if there was a key somewhere in the house, hidden in a drawer or under a loose floorboard. I wondered if the previous owner had kept it. I wondered if the realtor knew about it. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I wanted to take a picture, to prove to myself that the door was real. I aimed the camera, but the screen stayed blank. No image, just a black screen. I tried again. The screen flickered, then went black again. My phone felt warm in my hand, like it had been running too long. I put it away. I didn't want to know what the door might do to a camera. I stood there for a long time, staring at the keyhole, feeling the air press against my skin. I didn't touch it again. I didn't try to open it. I just stood there, listening to my own breathing, waiting for the feeling to fade. It didn't. Instead, it grew stronger. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, like someone was staring at me from a distance, like the door was looking back. I tried to think of something else, anything else. I thought about the boxes upstairs. I thought about the coffee I had made. I thought about the fact that I had a job, a life, and responsibilities. I tried to remind myself that this was just a house, and houses don't have secrets. But the door made me feel like I was wrong. It made me feel like I had stepped into something that had been waiting for me. I reached out again slowly and placed my hand on the door. I didn't push. I didn't pull. I just touched it like I was trying to feel its temperature. The wood was cold, but not in the way the basement air was cold. It was colder, like a stone that had been underground for years. The moment my hand touched the door, the basement seemed to go quiet. The sound of the bulb swinging stopped. The hum of the house above disappeared. Even my own breathing felt muted. I felt the door vibrate under my palm, like a small pulse. Then, as if the air itself had been cut, I heard a sound. A soft, gentle click. Not from the door, not from the lock. From inside the wall. It was the sound of a latch releasing. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to pull my hand away, but I couldn't move. It was like my body had decided to stay still, as if moving would make something worse. The air around the door grew heavier. The shadows seemed to gather closer. And then, very quietly, a faint voice whispered from the other side. Not a full sentence, not a clear word. Just a sound. Like someone breathing. Like someone trying not to be heard. I stepped back, my skin prickling. The feeling of being watched intensified. I looked around the basement, searching for any sign of movement. There was nothing. Just the door, the old keyhole, the silence. I backed up slowly, my eyes fixed on the door. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run. I wanted to forget. But the door stayed in my mind, like a memory that wouldn't fade. I walked up the stairs without looking back. When I reached the top, I leaned against the wall and tried to catch my breath. My hands were shaking. My heart was still racing. I told myself it was just stress, just a strange moment, just an old house playing tricks on my mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had opened. Something had noticed me. And the air in the basement felt different now, even from upstairs, like the house had shifted slightly, as if it had turned its attention toward me. I went to bed that night with the lights on, but I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the keyhole. I heard the faint click. I felt the pressure of the air around the door. And I knew, in a way I couldn't explain, that the locked room wasn't just a room. It was a boundary. And something on the other side had just started to move. The first night the voices started, I didn't believe them at first. I thought it was the house settling again, or maybe the pipes, or the wind moving through the old siding. I told myself I was being too sensitive, too tired, too new to the quiet of this place. But the sound wasn't like any of those things. It was too soft, too deliberate. It was the kind of whisper you hear when someone is trying not to be heard. I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling when I heard it. Not from the hallway, not from the living room, not from the kitchen. From the wall. The wall beside my bed, the one that separated my room from the basement. The one I had been avoiding since I first moved in. At first, it was just a faint murmur, like the house itself was speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I sat up slowly, my heart beating hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I listened. The whispering grew clearer, but still not words, just sounds, like someone trying to form sentences but stopping before they finished, like someone breathing through their teeth. I turned on my bedside lamp. The room lit up in a warm, soft glow. The light made the shadows shrink back, but it didn't change the sound. The whispering kept going, steady and quiet, like a person speaking from the other side of a door. I pressed my ear to the wall. The wood was cool under my skin. The plaster was rough, like it had been painted over many times. I listened for a pattern, for a word, for anything that made sense. Nothing. Just the whispers. And then, very faintly, I thought I heard my name. Not clearly, not loudly, just a sound that could have been my name if you wanted it to be. I pulled away from the wall, shaking my head. My stomach felt tight, like I had swallowed a stone. I told myself it was the stress of moving, the loneliness, the quiet. I told myself that if I stayed here long enough, I would get used to it. But the whispers didn't stop. They continued night after night, always around the same time, not long after midnight. Not at the moment I fell asleep, but when the house was at its quietest, when the world outside was sleeping. They would start as a faint murmur, and then grow slightly louder, as if someone was gathering the courage to speak. Sometimes I would lie there and feel like I was being watched, not by a person in the room, but by something inside the walls, something that could hear me, even when I didn't speak. The first few nights, I tried to ignore it. I told myself to be strong. I told myself that I was a grown person with a real job and responsibilities. I wasn't going to let a weird sound ruin my life. But the whispers were persistent. They didn't scream, they didn't shout, they didn't bang on the walls. They just kept talking softly, like someone telling a secret. One night I finally got up. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't stand the feeling of the voices pressing against the wall. I walked to the hallway and turned on the lights. The house felt different in the bright light. The shadows seemed less threatening. The air felt lighter. I went to the basement door and stood there for a moment, staring at it. The door looked normal. Just a door, just wood, just a way to get downstairs. I opened it and went down. The basement was cold and quiet. The bulb swung slightly, but the light was steady. I walked to the far corner where the locked door was. The door looked the same as before. The keyhole stared at me like a dark eye. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small notebook I had bought earlier that day. I had been using it to write down reminders, grocery lists, things I needed to remember. I held the notebook in my hand and stared at the door for a long time. I wasn't sure why I had brought it. Maybe because I felt like I needed to leave something behind, something to prove that I had been here, something to show the house that I was not afraid. I opened the notebook and tore out a blank page. I took a pen and wrote, in careful letters, "Who are you?" I didn't know why I wrote it. I just felt like I had to, like the whispering had become a person and I needed to speak back. I folded the paper and placed it on the floor in front of the locked door. I didn't put it in the keyhole. I didn't try to slide it under the door. I just left it there, like a small offering. Then I stood back and waited. For a moment, nothing happened. The basement was silent, except for the faint hum of the light. Then slowly, the air around the door began to feel heavier again. The shadows deepened. The quiet pressure returned, like the house was leaning in to listen. I felt my skin prickling. My hands were cold. The paper on the floor shifted. Not by wind. There was no breeze down there. The air was still. The paper moved like something had touched it, like a hand had brushed it and pushed it a little closer to the door. I watched frozen. The paper slid across the concrete, inch by inch, until it stopped right against the door. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. Then the whispering began. It was closer now, louder but still soft, like someone speaking into a pillow. I couldn't make out words, but I could feel the meaning. The sound had a rhythm, like a person speaking in a slow, careful way, like someone trying to be gentle. I stood there listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering went on for a long time, and I felt something in my mind begin to change. It was like the whispers were trying to reach inside me, like they were searching for something. I took a step back. My foot hit a loose board. The sound echoed in the basement. The whispering stopped instantly. The air felt normal again. The shadows softened. The house above seemed to wake up as if the silence had been broken. I didn't stay long after that. I went upstairs as fast as I could, my legs shaking. I closed the basement door behind me and locked it, even though the lock was old and didn't feel very strong. I sat on the floor in the hallway, leaning against the wall, and tried to calm myself. I kept thinking about the paper, the way it had moved, the way the whispering had stopped the moment I made a sound. It felt like the house had been listening, like it had been waiting for me to speak. The next day I tried to act normal. I went to work. I tried to laugh at my own fear. I told myself it was just my imagination. But that night the whispering returned. It was louder now, more confident, like the voice had found its shape. And this time, when I pressed my ear to the wall, I thought I heard a word. Not clear, not complete, but close enough that I couldn't ignore it. It sounded like my name. And I knew, with a certainty that made my stomach turn, that something inside the wall was trying to talk to me. Something that had been there long before I arrived. Something that didn't want to be forgotten. The day I found the diary, I wasn't looking for anything. I was simply trying to clean, trying to make the house feel like mine, trying to turn the old, dusty place into something I could live in without feeling like I was walking through someone else's memories. I had decided to start with the basement again. I told myself that if I could clean it, I could stop feeling the pull of that locked door. If I could scrub the concrete and organize the boxes, maybe the house would stop feeling like it was watching me. So I went downstairs with a bucket, some soap, and a sponge. I turned on the light and started working. The air was cold, but not as cold as before. The basement smelled like damp wood and old metal, but I tried to ignore it. I focused on the task, letting the repetitive motion of cleaning calm me. As I scrubbed near the far wall, I noticed something strange. One of the boxes was slightly out of place. Not much, just a few inches. Like someone had moved it recently and then pushed it back, but not all the way. I stopped cleaning and stared at it. My mind went back to the note I had left, the way the paper had moved, the way the whispering had stopped when I made a sound. I had the sudden, irrational thought that the house was testing me. I knelt down and pulled the box away from the wall. Behind it, tucked into a small gap between the concrete and the baseboard, was a thin, flat object. It looked like a book. My heart started to beat faster. I pulled it out carefully. The cover was worn, the leather cracked. It was a diary, old but not ancient. The kind of diary someone might have kept in the 1970s or 1980s. There was no title on the cover, no name, just a simple, plain book that looked like it had been hidden on purpose. I held it in my hands for a long time, feeling the weight of it. The leather was soft, but it had the smell of old paper and dust. It felt like a thing that had been kept in darkness for a long time. I didn't open it right away. I stood there in the basement, holding the diary, and listened. The air was quiet. The house above me seemed far away. The silence felt heavy, like the basement was holding its breath. I walked upstairs slowly, diary in hand, and sat at the kitchen table. The house felt brighter upstairs, even though the sun was low and the sky was gray. The light from the window made the dust in the air look like tiny floating particles. I opened the diary. The first page was blank. The second page had a date written at the top, in neat handwriting. June 14, 1979. Underneath, the writing began. It wasn't messy. It wasn't frantic. It was calm, like someone writing to themselves, like someone trying to remember. I started reading. The diary belonged to a woman named Evelyn. She wrote about ordinary things at first, about the weather, about the garden, about her husband who worked long hours and came home tired. She wrote about how the house felt old, even when it was new. But as I read, the tone changed. The entries became shorter, more urgent. She wrote about a man who came to the house one night, not a stranger, someone she knew, someone who shouldn't have been there. She wrote about a secret room, a door that didn't belong to the house, a keyhole that looked like it had been made for a different time. She wrote about whispers. And then on one page, she wrote something that made my stomach drop. She wrote, "The house remembers. It remembers everything. It keeps it all. I can't make it stop." I read that line again slowly. The house remembers. I looked around my kitchen at the old cabinets, the cracked paint, the worn floor. The house didn't feel like a building anymore. It felt like a mind. I kept reading. The diary told a story that was both ordinary and terrible. Evelyn wrote about a man named Thomas, her husband. She wrote about how he had changed over the years, how he had become angry, how he had started drinking, how he had started coming home late, smelling like smoke and cheap cologne. She wrote about the nights she heard him talking to someone in the basement. She wrote about the locked door, the one with the antique keyhole. She wrote about how she had tried to ignore it, how she had tried to pretend it wasn't real. But the house wouldn't let her. Evelyn wrote about finding a small room behind the locked door. She wrote about a secret space that was not on any blueprint. She wrote about a hidden room that seemed to exist between walls, a place that felt like it was carved out of the house itself. She wrote about what she found inside. A child's bed, a small dusty crib, and a smell that made her want to vomit. She wrote about the sound of a child crying, even though no child was there. She wrote about the feeling of being watched. And then, the entry that made my hands go cold. Thomas did it. He did something terrible. I can't say it out loud. The house knows. The house is keeping it. I can feel it. I can hear it in the walls. I sat there, the diary open in my hands, and felt the world tilt. My mind tried to reject it. It tried to tell me that it was just a story, that Evelyn was a person who had written something fictional, that this was just an old diary, a piece of someone's imagination. But the details were too real. The locked door, the keyhole, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. Everything matched what I had experienced. My breath came shallow and fast. I closed the diary for a moment and stared at the table. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I opened the diary again and kept reading. Evelyn wrote about the night she tried to leave. She wrote about packing a bag and planning to run. She wrote about how she had waited until Thomas fell asleep, then tiptoed downstairs to the basement. She wrote about the locked door and the keyhole, and how she had felt the air change when she touched it. She wrote about how she had heard the whispers for the first time. She wrote about how she had left a note on the floor, just like I had. She wrote, "I left a note. I thought it would make the house stop, but the note moved. The house moved it. It was like the house was laughing." My hands trembled. I remembered the paper moving, the whispering stopping when I made a sound, the way the air had felt heavy around the door. Evelyn's words were a mirror of my own experience. I kept reading. The diary entries became darker. The handwriting became more cramped, like she was writing faster, like she was afraid. She wrote about the day Thomas disappeared. She wrote that he went to work and never came back. She wrote that the police came, asked questions, searched the house. She wrote that they never found him. She wrote that the house had been quiet for a while after that. She wrote that she thought the secret room was closed forever. But then she wrote, she started hearing whispers again. And she wrote something that made my skin crawl. She wrote, "The house is not haunted. It is remembering. It remembers what happened. It remembers what we did." I sat there, holding the diary, and felt a cold realization settle in my bones. The house wasn't haunted in the way people think. There were no ghosts floating around, no chains, no dramatic shadows, no sudden screams. The house was a witness, and it was keeping the memory of something terrible. I looked around my kitchen again. I looked at the walls. I looked at the floor. I looked at the ceiling. I could feel the house watching me back. I could feel it remembering. I read the last entry in the diary. It was dated July 2, 1979. Evelyn wrote, "I don't know if I can stay. The house keeps talking. The whispers are louder. I think the house is trying to tell me something. I think it wants me to remember. I think it wants me to confess." Then the page ended. No more entries. No more words. Just blank pages. I closed the diary slowly, like I was closing a door. My hands were shaking. My heart was pounding. I felt sick, like I had just swallowed something bitter. I sat there for a long time, staring at the diary, trying to understand what it meant. Then I realized something that made my stomach drop. The diary had been hidden behind a box. The box had been pushed against the wall. Someone had wanted it to be found, or someone had wanted it to stay hidden. And I was the one who had found it. I felt a strange, heavy sense of responsibility, like I had been chosen, or like the house had decided I was the next person to hear its story. I looked at the locked door in my mind. I thought about the whispers behind the wall. I thought about the note moving across the floor. I thought about the diary and the way Evelyn had written about the house remembering. And I knew, with a certainty that made my throat tighten, that the house wasn't trying to scare me. It was trying to make me remember. The call came at 2 in the morning, the kind of hour when your mind is already half dreaming. I was half asleep, wrapped in the thin warmth of my blanket when the phone rang. The sound felt wrong in the quiet, too loud, too sharp, like a sudden knock on a door that should have been locked. I stared at the screen. Unknown number. I hesitated. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to let it ring until it stopped, to let the sound fade into the darkness. But something made me reach for the phone. "Hello," I said, my voice small, as if speaking too loudly might wake the house. A woman's voice answered, calm, smooth, like she had been awake for hours and had no trouble with the time. "Is this Mr. Kavanaugh?" I didn't like the way she said my name. It sounded like she was saying it because she had written it down somewhere, like it was a word on a list. "Yes," I said, sitting up. The blanket slipped off my shoulders. The room felt colder. "My name is Ms. Mercer," she said. "I'm a real estate agent. I'm calling about a property you might be interested in." I blinked. "At this hour?" She smiled, though I couldn't see her. I could almost hear the smile in her voice. "I don't sleep much. Some houses don't sleep either." I swallowed. "What property?" There was a pause, just long enough to make my stomach tighten. "A house," she said. "A house that isn't listed. A house that isn't on any website. A house that no one else sees." I frowned. "That doesn't make sense." "It makes sense if you understand the rules," she said softly. "And if you understand that some things are only visible to certain people." I stared at the phone, feeling the cold weight of the words settle in my chest. "Why are you calling me?" I asked. Another pause. "Because you've been looking," she said, quietly, patiently, like someone who knows what they want but doesn't want anyone else to notice. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure what she meant. I hadn't been looking. Not really. I'd been browsing like everyone does. I'd been scrolling through listings at night when I couldn't sleep. I'd been thinking about moving, about leaving my apartment, about finding a place where I could finally feel safe. But I hadn't been searching for a hidden house. "I don't know who you are," I said. "I know who you are," she replied. "And I know you've been feeling like you're running out of time." The words hit me harder than they should have. I didn't know her. I didn't know why she was talking like this, but it felt like she was speaking directly into something I was trying to keep hidden. "Who are you?" I asked again, more sharply. She sighed softly, like she was tired of repeating herself. "My name is Mercer. I work for a small agency. We don't advertise. We don't post online. We only show certain properties to certain people." I could hear her shifting, like she was leaning closer to the phone. The air around me felt heavy, as if the room had changed shape. "Why me?" I asked. "Because you've been searching for a place to start over," she said. "Because you've been looking for something quiet, something that doesn't have a history, something that doesn't have anyone else's story attached to it." I felt my throat tighten. I didn't want to admit it, but she was right. I wanted a place that felt empty enough to be mine. I wanted to forget. I wanted to stop hearing the past in my head. "What's the address?" I asked before I could stop myself. There was a soft, almost pleased sound on the other end. You don't need an address, she said. Not yet. I frowned. Then how do I find it? She spoke slowly, as if she were explaining something simple to a child. You'll know when you're close. I stared at the phone. The darkness of my room pressed in around me. The silence of the night felt deeper now, like it had been waiting for this call. And the viewing, I asked. It's free, she said. No cost, no deposit, no contract, just a simple visit. I felt suspicious. Why would you show me a house for free? Her voice grew softer. Because the house is lonely, she said, and it needs someone to see it. My skin prickled. That sounds like a joke. It's not a joke, she replied, and you can choose to believe me or not, but if you don't come, you'll always wonder what you missed. The idea of missing something kept me awake in the past. It had haunted me for years. The feeling of not knowing, of being left out of a truth that everyone else somehow understood. It was a familiar ache. Okay, I said before I knew I was saying it. When can I see it? She gave me a time. Tonight in an hour. I swallowed. Where? Again the pause, again the wait. On the road by the old mill, she said. You'll know the place. There's a gate that looks like it hasn't been used in years. I stared at the phone, my mind racing. The old mill. I knew the place. Everyone in town knew it. It had been abandoned for decades. People said it was dangerous. People said it was haunted. People said it was where the river went quiet and the air smelled like old metal. It was the kind of place you only went if you wanted to be alone. Why the old mill? I asked. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was quiet, almost gentle. Because the house is close, she said, and because the house doesn't like to be found by everyone. I felt a strange sensation in my chest, like a door opening inside me, like a memory I hadn't known I had was suddenly being pulled toward the surface. Is this a prank? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't do pranks, she said simply. I do viewings. I glanced at the clock. It was 2:14. The night felt too quiet, too still. My apartment felt small. My walls felt like they were closing in. I didn't want to go. And yet, the idea of not going felt worse. I imagined myself waking up tomorrow morning, the phone still in my hand, wondering what had happened, wondering if the call had been real, wondering if I had missed something that might have changed my life. I thought about the feeling of being stuck, the feeling of living inside someone else's story, the feeling of never being able to start over. And I thought about the way the woman had said the house was lonely. Lonely. Like it was a person. Like it had feelings. The idea was ridiculous, and yet it made my heart beat faster. Fine, I said finally, I'll come. She made a small sound, almost like a sigh of relief. Good, she said. I'll meet you at the gate. I hesitated. What's your name again? Mercer, she said. You'll know me when you see me. The line went quiet for a moment. Then she spoke again, softer this time. Don't bring anyone, she said. Not a friend, not a family member, not a neighbor, just you. I swallowed. Why? Because the house only opens for one person at a time, she said. It doesn't like witnesses. The words made my skin go cold. Not because they were scary, but because they felt like they belonged to something real, something that had rules. I didn't sleep after that. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet. Every sound felt louder. Every shadow felt closer. I kept thinking about the old mill, about the gate, about the idea of a house that no one else could see. I tried to tell myself it was just a strange phone call, a weird moment, a prank. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt like something inside me had already said yes. Like I had already agreed. Like I had already decided. And when the clock struck 3, I got out of bed, put on my coat, and walked out into the night, because the feeling of staying behind felt like a trap. Because I couldn't stop myself from wanting to know what was waiting for me. The drive to the old mill felt longer than it should have. The roads were empty, the streetlights sparse, and the night seemed to stretch out like a long, dark ribbon. My car's engine sounded too loud in the quiet, and the radio was off, because I didn't want any noise to interfere with the silence. I kept glancing at the clock, even though it didn't help. It was 3:20 a.m., the kind of hour when the world feels paused. The kind of hour when you start to wonder if time is real at all. I passed the familiar streets, the places I had driven 100 times, but everything looked different in the dark. The houses looked like shapes. The trees looked like shadows. The world felt less solid, as if it could change if I blinked. I tried to tell myself I was just tired, that I was imagining things, that the call had been a strange moment and I was making it more than it was. But the feeling in my chest kept growing, a quiet pressure, like the air itself was waiting. The road to the old mill was narrow and overgrown. The signs were faded. The pavement was cracked with weeds pushing through the gaps. I drove slowly, as if rushing would make something worse. I reached the place where the road ended, near the river. The old mill stood in the darkness, its silhouette broken and tall, like a ruined tower. I could barely make out the broken windows and the roof that looked like it had been torn open. And then I saw the gate. It was rusted, old, and half open. It looked like it had been left that way for years. The kind of gate that should have been locked, but wasn't. The kind of gate that made you think no one cared anymore. I stopped the car. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel. I sat there for a moment, staring at the gate, listening to the silence. There was no sound of the river, no wind, no animals, no insects, just the stillness of the night. It felt like the world had been paused. I got out of the car. The air was cold but not harsh. It was the kind of cold that makes your skin feel numb, like the temperature is pressing against you. I walked to the gate. The metal was cold under my fingers. I pushed it gently and it creaked. The sound felt too loud in the silence. I stepped through. The path beyond the gate was overgrown with grass and weeds. It looked like no one had walked here in years. The ground was uneven, with stones that had been pushed up by roots. The path led to a street that should not have been there. It was a small road, lined with houses on both sides. The houses looked like they had been built in the 1950s or 60s. The kind of homes you see in old neighborhoods, with small lawns and simple designs. But the street was empty. No cars, no lights, no movement. And the strange thing was, the street looked like it had been frozen in time. The grass was overgrown, but not too much, like it had been left alone for a while, but not long enough to completely take over. The mailboxes were still standing, but the names on them were faded. The paint on the houses was peeling, but not crumbling. The windows were dark, but not broken. It looked like a place where people had simply stepped away and never returned. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. My heart was beating too fast. My breath felt shallow. I had expected the old mill to be scary. I had expected the street to be empty, sure, but I had expected it to feel abandoned. I had expected it to feel like a ruin. Instead, it felt like a pause, like someone had hit stop. I walked slowly down the street. The silence followed me. It was not the quiet of a normal night. It was a deeper silence, like the world had been turned off. The houses looked normal, but they didn't feel normal. The windows were dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching from behind them. Not a person, not a neighbor, something else. I reached the first house. It was a small, simple home with a porch and a swing. The swing hung still, not moving at all. The porch light was off, but the bulb looked new, like someone had replaced it recently. I looked at the door. There was a for sale sign stuck in the yard. Not a real sign, not a normal sign. A sign that looked like it had been made by hand. It had no realtor name, no phone number, just the words, "For sale." I felt my stomach drop. The sign looked familiar. It looked like the sign from the basement. I stepped closer, my footsteps soft on the cracked pavement. The grass around the sign was slightly trampled, like someone had walked there recently, but there was no one in sight. I stood there for a long time, staring at the sign, trying to make sense of it. Then I heard something. A soft sound, like a whisper. Not from the house, not from the street, not from the air. From the walls. It was the same sound I had heard in my own house. The same whispering, like someone speaking from behind a thin barrier. I looked around, my heart pounding. The street was still empty. The houses were still dark. The silence was still heavy. But the whispering continued. It was faint, almost gentle, like a person speaking softly so they wouldn't be heard. I took a step back from the sign. The air felt colder now, like the temperature had dropped without warning. My skin prickled, my hands shook. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but there was no wind. The leaves on the trees were still. The grass didn't move. The whispering kept going. I walked further down the street, my eyes scanning the houses. Each one looked like it had been waiting for someone to come home, waiting for someone to notice. The street was lined with trees, and their branches formed a kind of tunnel overhead. The moonlight filtered through, casting thin patterns on the pavement. It was beautiful in a quiet, eerie way, but the beauty didn't comfort me. It made me feel like I was in a place that wasn't meant for me. I reached the end of the street. There was another gate. It looked identical to the first one. Rusted, old, half open, like it had been left like that on purpose. Beyond it, I could see the old mill again. The dark shape of it stood against the sky like a shadow. I stood there for a moment, looking back down the street. The houses looked like they were waiting for me to choose one, waiting for me to step closer, waiting for me to decide. I realized then that the street wasn't just abandoned. It was set up, like a stage, like a trap. I felt a sudden urge to leave, to run back through the gate, to get in my car, to drive away as fast as I could. But something held me, something quiet, something that felt like curiosity mixed with dread. I didn't want to admit it, but I wanted to see what was at the end of the street. I wanted to know why the place looked like it had been frozen in time. I wanted to know why the house was lonely. I turned and started walking back toward the first house. The whispering followed me. It was still faint, still soft, but it was closer now. Like the sound had moved with me, like the street itself was speaking. I reached the house with the sign. I stood in front of it, my heart pounding. The air felt thick, the silence felt heavy. And I realized something that made my stomach drop. The street wasn't empty. It was waiting for me. The street felt longer than it should have, like the distance was stretching without me noticing. I walked slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The whispering followed me, soft and constant, like a sound that had nowhere else to go. I kept telling myself I was imagining it, that the street was empty and I was simply alone, that the silence was getting to me, but the feeling in my chest wouldn't let me ignore it. I reached the end of the road again, where the gate opened to the old mill. The silhouette of the building stood against the night sky, dark and still. The moonlight made it look like a black stain on the horizon. And then I saw it. A house. It was not there before. I knew it. I had walked this street twice already, and there had been nothing at the end. Just the old mill and the river beyond. Just the empty darkness. But now, standing at the edge of the street, was a house. It was a simple house, not too large. A 2-story home with a porch and a small front yard. The paint was a faded white, and the roof looked worn. The windows were dark but not broken. The house looked like it had been built in the same era as the others on the street. But it didn't fit. It looked too new to be part of this frozen place. It looked like it had been placed there, carefully, like a piece of a puzzle. I stood there for a long moment, staring. My heart felt like it was trying to climb out of my chest. The whispering stopped. The silence became heavy, as if the street itself was holding its breath. I took a step forward. The house seemed to get closer. I took another step. The air felt colder now. The wind was still, but the temperature had dropped, like the night had thickened around the house. I walked toward the porch. The porch steps were worn, but not too worn. The wood looked solid, like someone had been maintaining it. The porch light was off, but the bulb inside the fixture looked new, as if it had been replaced recently. I reached the front door. There was no handle, no keyhole, just a smooth surface like the door had been painted over a long time ago. The paint was old, but the door itself looked sturdy. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of it. The house felt alive in a way the others didn't. It felt like it was waiting. I pressed my palm against the door. The wood was cold. I waited. Nothing happened. I pulled my hand away, and the air seemed to shift again, like the house was adjusting to my presence. I tried the door. It opened. Not with a creak, not with a groan, just a soft, quiet movement like the house was letting me in. I stepped inside. The smell hit me first. The smell of old wood and dust, mixed with something sweet, like the scent of flowers that had been left in a vase too long. It was a strange combination, comforting and unsettling at the same time. The house was dark, but not completely. There was a faint light coming from somewhere deeper inside, like a lamp left on in another room. I walked forward slowly, my footsteps quiet on the floor. The house felt larger inside than it looked from the outside. The ceiling was high and the walls were lined with old pictures, family photos, people I didn't know, faces frozen in time. The air felt thick, like it was filled with memories. I called out softly, "Hello." My voice sounded small in the space. It echoed slightly, but not in a loud way. The house didn't feel empty. It felt full, full of something that didn't want to be disturbed. I waited. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I heard it. Laughter. Distant laughter coming from somewhere deeper in the house. Not loud, not wild, just a soft sound like people laughing quietly in another room. My heart jumped. I stood still, listening. The laughter faded, but it left a feeling behind. A feeling like someone had been here recently, like someone had just left. I took a few steps forward, following the sound. The hallway was long and narrow, with doors on both sides. The wallpaper was faded, the pattern old-fashioned. The floorboards creaked slightly under my weight. The laughter came again, farther away this time. It sounded like children, or maybe adults trying to sound like children. The sound was too light, too bright for a place like this. I kept walking. The air felt colder as I moved deeper into the house. My breath became visible, like small clouds in front of my face. I didn't understand why it was so cold inside. There were no windows open. There was no wind. I reached a room at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly open. The light inside was dim, like a lamp had been left on. The room looked like a living room with a sofa and a small table. There were toys scattered on the floor, a few stuffed animals, a small wooden train, a doll with a cracked face. Everything looked old but not abandoned. It looked like someone had been here recently and had just stepped away for a moment. I stepped into the room. The laughter stopped. The silence returned, thick and heavy. I stood there looking around, my heart pounding. I felt like I was intruding on a private moment, like I had walked into a place where time had been paused. I noticed a small doorway on the far side of the room. It led to a staircase going down. The laughter had come from below. I didn't want to go down. I didn't want to follow the sound. But something inside me, something quiet and stubborn, kept pushing me forward. I took the first step down. The air grew colder. The darkness thickened. The sound of my own footsteps seemed too loud, like the house was listening. I reached the bottom of the stairs and saw a narrow hallway. The walls were lined with old wallpaper, the pattern faded and peeling. The air smelled like damp earth. The laughter came again, closer now. I followed the sound until I reached a door. The door was closed. It had a small window in the top, like a door you might see in a school or an old office. The glass was fogged, so I couldn't see through it clearly. I stood there, my hand hovering near the knob. The laughter stopped. The silence returned. And then from the other side of the door, I heard footsteps. Slow footsteps, walking back and forth. Not running, not frantic, just slow, steady steps like someone packing. I felt my throat tighten. I pressed my ear to the door. I couldn't hear any voices, just the footsteps, just the sound of someone moving. I pulled my ear away, my skin prickling. I wanted to leave. I wanted to go back upstairs, out of the house, out of this strange place. But I couldn't move. The house felt like it had wrapped itself around me, like it had a hold on my attention. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Then very softly, I heard a whisper. Not from the wall, not from the air. From inside the door. My name. Just once. And I knew, with a quiet certainty that made my stomach drop, that the house was not empty. It was full of people. Or at least it had been. And it was still holding on to them. I thought I would meet her at the gate. I pictured a car or a figure stepping out of the darkness, someone with a name tag and polite smile, someone normal, someone real. But when I reached the gate at the old mill, there was no one there. Just the empty road, stretching into the night, and the shape of the mill beyond, silent and still. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the quiet. My breath puffed small clouds in the cold air. I felt a strange pull, like the road was inviting me forward, urging me to walk deeper into the dark. I didn't want to go. I felt a sudden urge to turn back, to get in my car and pretend I had never answered the phone. Pretend I had never heard her voice. Pretend the whole thing had been a dream. But the road was still there, waiting. I walked. My footsteps made soft sounds on the gravel, and the silence seemed to grow around them, like the night was absorbing each step. I thought about the phone call again, her voice so calm, almost whispering, as if ease and danger were the same thing. She had said the house doesn't like witnesses. She had said the house is lonely. She had said I would know her when I saw her. I kept glancing into the shadows, half expecting a figure to step into view. A car parked on the shoulder, a person leaning against the guardrail, something familiar. Nothing. The street beyond the gate looked abandoned, frozen in time. And at the end of it, just as she had said, a house appeared. Not obvious at first, just a dark shape against the darker night. But as I got closer, I could see the lines of it, the shape of the roof, the silent windows that stared like unblinking eyes. It was quiet, too quiet. No wind rustled the trees, no crickets chirped. Even the air felt still, like it didn't want to move. I walked up to the porch, and that was when I felt it, like a shift in the world. A soft thrum under my feet, like something waiting just beneath the surface. I stood still, breathing slowly, trying to calm my racing heart. And then I heard her voice. Hello. It was soft, female, close. But when I turned, there was no one on the porch. Just the house. The voice came again, gentle, as if she were right beside me. Come inside. I didn't see a figure. I didn't see a face. Just the air around me, still and quiet. I wanted to speak, to ask who she was, but my mouth felt heavy. My words wouldn't come. Instead, I stepped onto the porch. The wood beneath my feet was warm, like it had absorbed sunlight earlier in the day, even though it was night. I touched the railing with one hand and felt the warmth spread through my fingertips. Then the front door began to open. Slowly, no sound, no creak, just a movement like the house exhaling. I stepped inside. The interior looked normal at first. A simple living room with a couch and a small table. A lamp glowed faintly, as if someone had just been sitting there, reading a book. But the air was heavier here, thicker. It felt like the house was pressing in around me. I called out, my voice soft, "Hello." No answer, just a stillness that felt alive. I took another step, and the door shut behind me, quiet and final. I felt it in that moment, the sense of being watched, as if the house itself was paying attention to every breath I took. I started to walk forward slowly, like I was moving through water. Every step made the air feel heavier. And then I saw her. Not fully, not a whole person, just a shadow, a shape that flickered at the edge of my vision. And a voice, soft, calm, almost soothing. "Welcome." I turned my head slightly, trying to see who was speaking. But whenever I looked directly toward the voice, there was only shadow, only the pattern of light and darkness on the wall. Her voice continued, gentle and patient. "I knew you would come." "How?" I whispered. The voice paused, and for a moment it felt like the room breathed with me. "You answered the call," she said. I swallowed hard. "Why are you here?" I asked. There was no face, just the feeling of presence, as if she were standing behind the shadows. "You wanted a place no one else sees," she said. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady myself. The air felt too heavy, like it was pressing against my chest, like every breath was harder than the last. "What is this place?" I finally asked. "This place finds people," she said. "People who don't belong anywhere else. People who are unseen." I felt a chill creep up my spine. "I'm not lost," I said, though my voice sounded thin. She didn't answer right away. Instead, I heard a soft shuffle, like movement in another room. And then a new sound, footsteps, slow, measured on wooden floors. But the footsteps didn't come closer. They echoed from somewhere deeper in the house. "What was that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Others," she said. "They came before you." I felt a cold drop of fear settle in my stomach. "What do you mean, others?" "People who were drawn here," she said. "People who needed a place to belong." I didn't like the sound of that. The way she said it felt too easy, like she was offering something gentle, something comforting. But something in me didn't trust it. "How long have you been here?" I asked. "Long enough," she said. "Long enough to know you would come." I took another step forward, my eyes scanning the room. The furniture looked normal, but the air felt unnatural, heavy, watching. "My name is," I started, then stopped. I didn't know why. Her name felt like a question mark I didn't want to answer. She spoke without hesitation. "Mercer." I stopped, breathing for a moment. The same name from the call. The same voice from the phone. But no face. No person. Just the whisper of a name coming from the shadows. "Why won't you show yourself?" I asked. There was silence. Then softly she spoke again. "The house does not like witnesses." The words felt sharp in the silence, like they were meant to cut something open, to let the truth seep out. "What do you mean?" I said. She didn't answer right away. Instead, I heard the footsteps again, slow, steady, circling somewhere deep in the house. I could feel them, not see them, but feel the rhythm of each step, like a heartbeat I couldn't ignore. "Those who come here don't leave," she said at last. I felt my breath catch. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "The house collects them," she said. "One by one, people who wander here at night, people who answer the call." My heart pounded. I felt sweat gather at the back of my neck. "Collects them," I repeated. "Yes," she said with a quiet certainty. "It keeps them, it holds them, it remembers them." I took a step back. The air felt thicker. The room seemed smaller. I could feel the walls pressing in. "What do you mean, keeps them?" I said. "There are those who never left," she said. "They linger, their footsteps echo, their laughter fades, but they stay." I felt a cold rush in my veins. I thought about the footsteps I had heard earlier, the laughter, the whispers. I tried to make sense of it, but my mind felt foggy, like the words were slipping through my fingers before I could hold them. "Mercer, are you a person?" I said, my voice trembling. There was a long silence. Then softly she said, "Some people think so." The answer didn't comfort me. It unsettled me. I felt like I was on the edge of something I couldn't understand, something too heavy to hold, something that didn't make sense. And in that moment, I realized something that made my heart drop. I had walked into a place no one else sees. I had come willingly. And whatever this house was, it had been waiting for me. I didn't mean to take the job, not at first. I was just looking for something quiet, something simple, a place where I could disappear for a while, away from the noise of people and the constant feeling of being watched by strangers. The kind of job that doesn't ask too many questions. I found the listing online late one night. It was a short message, almost too simple. Caretaker needed. Old mansion. Private. No salary listed. No company name, just a phone number and an address. I called. The voice on the other end was calm, polite, and very old. It sounded like someone who had been speaking softly for a long time. When I asked questions, they answered in a way that made me feel like I was interrupting. The owner told me the house was in a quiet area, far from the city, that it had been in their family for generations, that the previous caretaker had left suddenly, without explanation. "Are there any problems?" I asked. "No," the owner said. "Just keep the place maintained, clean the rooms, keep the grounds tidy, make sure the lights work, that is all." I asked about the attic. The owner paused for a moment, and I could hear something like a sigh through the line. "The attic is private," they said. "Do not go there." I laughed softly. "Okay, no problem." But even as I said it, I felt a strange chill in my body. Not because of the warning, but because of the way they said it. Not harsh, not angry, just firm, like a rule that had been repeated for a long time. When I arrived at the mansion, it was even more impressive than the photos had shown. The building was large, with tall windows and a heavy front door. The walls were made of old stone, and the roof was covered in dark shingles that looked like they had been there for decades. The grounds were overgrown, but not wild. The grass was long in places, and the trees cast deep shadows across the yard. It felt like the house had been waiting for someone to return. I parked my car in the driveway and stood for a moment, looking at the mansion. The air was still, and the only sound was the distant call of a bird. The front door was heavy when I pushed it open. It made a deep, quiet sound, like the house itself was taking a breath. Inside, the air was cool. The smell was a mix of old wood, dust, and something faintly sweet. The kind of smell you get in places that haven't been lived in for a long time, but that still hold the memory of people. I walked through the foyer and into the main hall. The floorboards creaked softly under my feet. The walls were lined with portraits of people I didn't know. Their faces were serious, their eyes dark and watchful. A small bell sat on a table near the stairs. I rang it once, just to see if anyone would come. No one did. I waited. The silence felt heavy, like the house was listening to me. Then I heard footsteps above me. Soft footsteps, slow. They sounded like someone walking on the upper floor, but they weren't loud. Not like a person walking, more like a careful, measured pace. I called out, "Hello." The footsteps stopped. I waited for a moment, but nothing happened. Then from the top of the stairs, a voice called down, "You must be the new caretaker." The voice was calm and steady, but it sounded distant, like it was coming from far away. "I'm here," I said. "I'm." A figure appeared at the top of the stairs. I couldn't see their face clearly. The lighting was dim, and the person was standing in shadow, but I could tell they were dressed neatly, like someone who had always been careful about appearance. They descended the stairs slowly, as if they were taking their time to see if I was truly there. When they reached the bottom, they stopped and looked at me. Their eyes were dark, and their expression was unreadable. "You've come," they said. "Yes," I replied. "I'm the new caretaker." They nodded once. "Good," they said. "You will do well here." They spoke softly, like they didn't want to wake something. Then they walked past me and into a nearby room. They didn't turn to look back. I followed them, not because I wanted to, but because I felt like I was being pulled. We entered a study. The room was lined with bookshelves filled with old, leather-bound books. A large desk sat in the center. A lamp on the desk gave off a warm glow. The owner sat behind the desk, hands folded. Their face was calm, but there was a strange distance in their eyes, like they were looking through me rather than at me. "I'm glad you accepted the position," they said. "Thank you," I replied, trying to sound confident. "I'm happy to be here." The owner leaned forward slightly. "There are a few rules," they said. "Very simple rules." I nodded, listening. "First," they said, "do not let anyone in." "What if someone comes?" I asked. "Then you do not answer," they said. "You do not open the door, you do not speak to them. You simply wait until they leave." I swallowed. "Okay." "Second," they said, "do not go into the attic." I felt the chill again. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like a deep, instinctive warning. "Why?" I asked. The owner's voice stayed calm. "Because the attic is not a place," they said. "It is a boundary." I didn't know what that meant, but I nodded anyway. "And third," they said, "do not stay up late." I raised an eyebrow. "I'm the caretaker. I need to stay up late sometimes." The owner's eyes held mine for a moment, and I felt a strange pressure in the room, like the air was getting heavier. "Do not stay up late," they repeated. "The house does not like it." I nodded again, but my mind was already spinning. Why was the owner warning me like this? Why did they speak like someone who had lived in the house for too long? The owner stood up and walked to the window. They looked out at the dark grounds, their posture stiff. "I will be upstairs," they said. "If you need anything, call for me." I nodded. They turned and walked toward the stairs, and I watched them go. When they reached the landing, they paused. Then they turned back and spoke again, quietly. "And remember," they said, "do not go into the attic." Then they disappeared into the darkness upstairs. I stood there for a moment, alone in the study. The lamp on the desk cast long shadows across the room. The bookshelves looked like silent watchers. The air felt thick, like something had been added to it. I looked at the stairs. I looked at the hallway. I looked at the ceiling, where the attic door was hidden behind a small panel. And I felt the strange urge to know what was up there. Not because I wanted to break the rules, but because the warning made the attic feel alive, like it was holding something important. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts. I reminded myself I was here for a job, a quiet job, a simple job. I walked out of the study and began to explore the mansion. The rooms were grand and empty. The furniture was covered in white sheets. The floors were dusty. The air was cool but not cold. It felt like the house had been waiting for someone to come back, like it had been holding its breath. I went through the dining room, the kitchen, the library. Each room felt quiet but not silent, like the house was full of memories that weren't quite gone. When I reached the hallway that led to the attic stairs, I stopped. The panel was there, the small door in the ceiling, the place the owner had warned me about. I stood under it, staring. The warning echoed in my mind. "Do not go into the attic." I felt the strange pull again, the urge to know, the feeling that something was waiting. I took a step back, and I told myself, out loud, in a voice that sounded too calm for the situation, "I won't go up there." Then I walked away. But I could still feel it, the attic, the boundary, like something was behind it, and it was watching me. I didn't sleep much that first night. It wasn't because I was scared, not at first. It was because the house felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. The kind of quiet that makes you listen to every small sound and wonder if it belongs to the building or to your own mind. The owner's warning kept replaying in my head. Do not go into the attic. I told myself I would respect it. I told myself I would stay downstairs, do my work, and leave the attic alone. I even repeated the words out loud, like a promise. But the moment I woke up, I noticed something different. The panel in the ceiling was open. The attic door was no longer closed. The small panel that hid it had been pushed aside, and the door itself was slightly ajar. I stood in the hallway, staring up at it. The dark opening seemed to breathe. The air that came out of it was colder than the rest of the house. It smelled like dust and old wood, and something faintly sweet, like the scent of old toys. I should have closed it. I should have told myself to forget it. But I didn't. I walked closer. My footsteps felt too loud in the quiet hallway. Each step seemed to echo in the empty space, like the house was listening. I reached the panel and looked up. The attic door was a simple wooden door, painted the same faded white as the rest of the house. It had a small brass knob, no lock, no keyhole. It looked like it had been there for a long time, untouched. I placed my hand on the knob. It was cold. I hesitated, my heart beating faster. The warning from the owner came back again, like a voice behind my ear. Do not go into the attic. I closed my eyes for a moment and took a slow breath. I told myself I wasn't going to go in. I was just going to look. Just a quick glance. I turned the knob. The door opened. Not with a creak, not with a sound at all. It simply moved, like the house was letting me in. A thin beam of light slipped through the opening, cutting the darkness of the hallway. The air from the attic drifted down, colder than anything in the rest of the house. I stared into the darkness above. The attic was not lit, but the darkness felt different. It felt like a room that was waiting for someone to arrive. I lifted my head and looked inside. The attic was filled with dust, thick dust, like a layer of old memory. The beams of the ceiling were visible and the floorboards looked worn. The air was heavy, and my breath felt like it was being pulled away from me. I could see boxes stacked in the corners, old furniture covered with sheets, the kind of storage that makes you feel like the house has been hiding things for years. But then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. A dollhouse. It sat in the middle of the attic, placed carefully on a small table. The dollhouse was old, made of wood. It looked like it had been handcrafted. And it looked familiar. I stepped closer, my feet moving slowly, like I was walking through water. The air grew colder with each step. The dust rose around my shoes, floating in the light like tiny particles of memory. The dollhouse was detailed, very detailed. It had windows and a front porch, a small yard, a driveway, even tiny trees. And as I looked at it, my heart began to pound. Because it was the mansion. It was the same mansion I was standing in. Every detail was there, the same shape of the roof, the same placement of the windows, the same front door, the same porch. It was like a miniature version of the house, perfectly recreated. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the air in front of me. The dollhouse looked like it had been made by someone who knew the house better than anyone else, someone who had studied it, someone who had lived inside it. I touched the roof gently with my fingertips. The wood was smooth, worn by time. And then I noticed something else. The dollhouse was not empty. There were tiny figures inside. I looked through the windows. Tiny furniture, tiny rooms, tiny people. A family, I think, or at least figures that looked like a family, standing in the living room, sitting at a small table, a tiny figure in a hallway like someone walking. I felt a strange ache in my chest, like the house was showing me something I wasn't supposed to see. I leaned closer to the front door of the dollhouse. The tiny front door was slightly open. I felt my hand tremble. I didn't know why. It wasn't a scary thing exactly. It was more like a quiet warning, like the dollhouse was a mirror that was too honest. I pulled my hand away. The air in the attic felt thicker, as if the room itself was watching me. I looked around, half expecting to see someone behind me, but the attic was empty. Just boxes, just dust, just the dollhouse. I stepped back and stared at it again. The tiny figures inside seemed to shift. Not moving like real people, more like a change in the way the light hit them. Like the dollhouse was adjusting, like it was alive in a way I couldn't understand. I felt a sudden urge to leave, to go back downstairs, close the panel, and forget I had ever seen it. But my feet didn't move. I couldn't look away. Then, as I watched, the tiny front door of the dollhouse opened a little wider. A small figure stepped out. It was too small to see clearly, but I could tell it was moving toward the front steps of the miniature house. The figure paused at the top of the tiny steps, and then it turned. It looked directly at me. I felt a cold wave run through my body. The tiny figure's face was not clear, but the feeling of being seen was too strong, like the dollhouse had looked back at me. I swallowed hard. My mouth felt dry. I took a step back. The attic air seemed to tighten, like a hand closing around my throat. I looked away from the dollhouse and saw something I hadn't noticed before. A small key. It lay on the floor just a few feet away from the table, old brass with a worn handle. I didn't know where it had come from. I didn't know why it was there, but I felt my hand reach for it before I could stop it. The moment my fingers touched the key, the attic door behind me slammed shut. Not loudly, not violently, just a soft final sound. Like the house had decided I was done looking. I froze. My heart hammered. I turned slowly, expecting to see the door, expecting to see darkness. But the door was closed, the panel was shut, the attic was silent. I held the key in my hand and stared at the dollhouse. The tiny figure was still there, standing on the steps, watching. I realized then that the attic door had opened on its own. Not because someone had come upstairs. Not because of a draft. Because the house had wanted me to see the dollhouse. Because it had wanted me to know what was inside. And the key in my hand felt like a promise. Like the house was offering me a choice. A choice I didn't want to make. That night, I tried to ignore the attic. I tried to act like it hadn't happened. Like the dollhouse wasn't sitting upstairs, waiting. Like the key in my pocket wasn't heavy with meaning. But the house has a way of making you feel like you're already part of it. I stayed downstairs. I cleaned the kitchen. I checked the lights. I made sure the windows were locked. I did the things a caretaker does, the things that feel normal. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I kept expecting to hear a sound, anything, to remind me that I was still alone. But there was only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the clock in the hallway. Around midnight, I finally decided to go to bed. I lay down in the small room the owner had given me. The room was simple, with a bed and a small nightstand. The walls were bare. The air was cool. I closed my eyes. I tried to breathe slowly. I tried to tell myself I was safe. But the house felt different at night. The shadows seemed deeper. The silence felt heavier, like the house was listening more closely when the world outside was quiet. I turned over, facing the wall, and tried to fall asleep. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Tiny footsteps. Soft, like someone walking on a wooden floor. They were quiet, but clear enough to make my skin prickle. I sat up slowly. The footsteps were not coming from the hallway. They were not coming from the main floor. They were coming from above. The attic. My heart began to race. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that it was just the house settling, that the sound was coming from somewhere else. But the footsteps continued. They moved slowly, like someone walking carefully, one step at a time. I listened, my breath shallow. The footsteps crossed the floor above my head. Then they stopped. For a moment there was silence, and then a soft click, like a small door opening. I felt a cold wave wash over me. The sound of the footsteps returned. They began again, slow and steady. But now they were moving closer. They were moving toward the stairs. I held my breath. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to do anything that would make the house notice me. But the footsteps continued. They reached the top of the stairs. They paused, and then the sound of tiny footsteps moved down the stairs. My chest tightened. I wanted to call out. I wanted to shout. I wanted to demand to know what was happening. But my voice felt trapped in my throat. The footsteps reached the hallway outside my room. They paused again. I could feel my heart beating in my ears. The footsteps moved toward my door. Slowly, carefully, like someone testing if I was awake. I pressed my back against the wall and stared at the door. The footsteps stopped right outside. For a moment there was silence, and then a soft, faint sound. A tiny tapping, like someone knocking with a small finger. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited, listening. The tapping came again. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like it was coming from the other side of the door. My mind raced. I thought about the attic, the dollhouse, the tiny figure. I thought about the key in my pocket. I thought about the owner's warning. Do not go into the attic. Do not stay up late. The tapping stopped. The silence returned. I waited for a long moment, afraid to move. Then the footsteps began again. This time, they weren't moving away. They were moving around the room. I could hear them shifting, like someone walking in small circles. I held my breath, feeling the weight of the house around me. The footsteps stopped near the window. Then I heard something I didn't expect. A soft, tiny voice. Not a whisper. A small, childlike voice. Hello, it said. My body went cold. I didn't respond. I didn't move. The voice continued, quiet and calm. Are you there? My throat tightened. I wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The voice spoke again. Don't be afraid. The words sounded gentle, like someone trying to comfort me. But the sound of the voice felt wrong in the house. It felt like a stranger speaking in a place where strangers don't belong. I finally managed to whisper, "Who are you?" There was a pause. Then the voice said, "I'm here." That was it, that was all. Just those words. I felt a strange urge to get up, to open the door, to see what was making the sound. But I didn't move. I stayed still, trying to control my breathing. The voice spoke again, almost softly, like someone talking to a friend in the dark. Come play. My heart pounded. Play, I whispered. The voice giggled softly. It sounded like a child, but the sound of it was too calm, too quiet, like it had been practicing. Then the footsteps moved again. They walked across the room. They moved toward my bed. I felt the bed shift slightly, like something small was stepping onto it. I tried to keep my eyes closed. I tried to pretend I was asleep. But the feeling of something near me was too strong. The footsteps moved closer to my pillow. And then I felt a light touch. A small pressure, like a tiny finger pressing against the edge of the pillow. I froze. My body felt numb. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to react. The voice spoke again, soft and calm. Look. I didn't want to, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned my head slowly. The room was dark, but I could see a faint shape near the edge of the bed. A small figure, too small to be a person. A tiny shape that looked like a doll. It was standing on the floor beside my bed, looking up at me. Its face was blank, like a toy's face. But I felt like it was watching me. I stared at it, my heart racing. The tiny figure moved. Not quickly, just a small shift, like it was adjusting its position. Then it lifted its hand and pointed, not at me, at the corner of the room, where the shadow was thickest. My eyes followed the direction of its finger, and I saw it, a small dollhouse, sitting on the floor, in the corner. I didn't remember putting it there. I didn't remember seeing it before. But there it was, the same dollhouse I had seen in the attic. Only now it was in my room. The tiny figure in the corner moved again. It walked toward the dollhouse, and the sound of its footsteps matched my own. Every time I moved, the tiny footsteps moved too. It felt like the dollhouse was copying me, like the house was watching me through the tiny world inside it. I tried to speak, but my voice was too weak. The tiny figure reached the dollhouse and stood beside it. It looked up at me again, and the voice spoke, quiet and calm. Now you can see. I felt a cold wave of dread, because I realized in that moment that the house wasn't just a building. It was a living thing, and it had been waiting for someone to move inside its tiny world. I didn't sleep at all that night. Not because I was scared of the dark, not because I thought something was going to jump out at me. It wasn't like that. It was worse. It was the feeling of being watched, even when no one was there. I stayed awake, listening to the house breathe. The dollhouse sat in the corner of my room like a quiet secret. The tiny figure beside it had disappeared. I wasn't sure if it had left or if it had simply melted into the shadows. But the dollhouse was there, and I couldn't stop looking at it. The house felt different in the morning. The air felt heavier. The light that came through the window looked dimmer, as if the day was reluctant to begin. I tried to keep myself busy. I cleaned the kitchen. I checked the locks. I walked through the rooms trying to convince myself I was just tired, that I was overreacting. But the feeling stayed, like a shadow following me. I kept thinking about the tiny footsteps, the voice, the way the dollhouse had appeared in my room. I couldn't shake the idea that the house was changing, and that I was becoming part of the change. Later that day, I went back to the attic. I told myself I was going to close the door. I was going to put the dollhouse back where it belonged. I was going to stop the house from doing whatever it was doing. I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling the wood creak under my feet. The air grew colder as I reached the attic. The dust floated in the beam of light from the window. The dollhouse sat on the table, exactly where I had left it. The tiny figures inside were still there. I leaned closer and looked through the windows. Everything looked the same. The family, the furniture, the tiny rooms. But there was something different. A small figure was now standing in the hallway of the dollhouse. Not the one I had seen before, not the one that had moved. This one was new. It stood near the front door, as if it was waiting. I felt my heart rate increase. I stared at the tiny figure, trying to make sense of it. And then I noticed something else. The tiny figure was facing the front door of the dollhouse, not looking outward, looking inward, as if it was watching something inside the tiny world. I looked away, feeling a sudden wave of nausea. I didn't want to see any more. I left the attic quickly, closing the door behind me. The air in the hallway felt warmer, as if I had stepped back into a place that wasn't meant to be cold. When I returned to my room, the dollhouse was still there. I hadn't moved it. I hadn't brought it down. It was just there. I stared at it for a long time, trying to understand. I sat on the bed and tried to calm myself. I told myself I was tired, that I was imagining things. But then I noticed something. A doll. Not in the dollhouse. A real doll. Sitting on my nightstand. I didn't remember seeing it there before. It was a simple doll about a foot tall. Its dress was faded and its hair was tangled. Its eyes were glassy and dark. It was facing me. And it was not just facing me, it was looking at me. I felt my skin go cold. I didn't know where the doll had come from. I didn't know how it had gotten into my room. But I knew one thing. It hadn't been there when I went to sleep. I stared at the doll for a long time. The doll didn't move. It didn't blink. It didn't speak. It just sat there, facing me, watching. I stood up slowly and walked closer. I kept my eyes on the doll, afraid to look away. The doll's face was expressionless, but there was something in its gaze that made me feel like it was aware of me. I reached out and touched its shoulder. The doll's body was cold, like it had been sitting in a cold room for a long time. I pulled my hand back quickly. The doll did not move. I sat back on the bed, my heart racing. I tried to tell myself that it was just a doll, that it was a toy, that it couldn't do anything. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The doll remained facing me, its eyes fixed on my face. I glanced toward the door. I wanted to leave the room. I wanted to run. I wanted to get away from the house and never come back. But something held me there. Something quiet. Something that felt like curiosity. I kept staring at the doll. And then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The doll's head had turned slightly. Not a lot, just a small movement. But it was enough to make my stomach drop. It was now looking directly at the dollhouse in the corner. I followed its gaze. The dollhouse was still there, sitting quietly in the corner. But now, the tiny figures inside seemed to be arranged differently. One of the tiny figures was standing in the front room, facing outward, like it was looking out at me. I felt my breath catch. The doll's head turned again. This time, it was looking directly at me. Its eyes were fixed on mine, and I felt a strange, sinking feeling in my chest. Like the doll was not just watching me, like it was waiting for me to do something. I stood up again, my legs shaking. I walked closer to the dollhouse. The dollhouse looked the same as before, but the tiny figure inside was now standing in the hallway, facing the front door. It was as if the tiny figure was mimicking the doll on my nightstand. I felt a sudden urge to move the doll, to turn it away, to stop it from watching me. I reached out, my hand trembling, and picked up the doll. Its weight was heavier than it looked. I turned it slightly, so it faced away from me. The doll's eyes shifted with my movement, as if it was adjusting itself to keep looking at me. I froze. I turned the doll back toward me. It stared. I turned it away again. It stared. I realized then that the doll was not just a doll. It was connected to the house. It was connected to the dollhouse. And it was learning me. It was learning my movements, learning how I looked, learning how I reacted. I placed the doll back on the nightstand, facing me again. I sat on the bed and tried to breathe. I told myself I was tired, that I was overthinking, that the house was just old and strange. But the doll's gaze didn't feel like a strange toy. It felt like a person watching me. And the dollhouse in the corner seemed to agree, because the tiny figure inside moved again. This time, it moved toward the front door of the dollhouse, as if it was leaving, as if it was coming out. I stared at the dollhouse, my heart pounding. The doll on my nightstand remained still, but I could feel its eyes on me. I realized then that the house was not just collecting people. It was copying them. It was learning how to move, how to watch, how to wait. And I was the next one it wanted to learn. The next morning, I woke up with the same feeling I'd had since the doll appeared. Not fear exactly. More like the feeling you get when you realize you've forgotten something important and you don't know what it is. I sat up slowly and looked toward the dollhouse in the corner. The doll was still on the nightstand, facing me. And for a moment, I thought I saw it smile. But that was impossible. Dolls don't smile, they don't move, they don't think. They don't watch. I tried to tell myself that, but my mind kept returning to the same thought. The doll wasn't just watching me. It was learning me. I got out of bed and walked to the corner where the dollhouse sat. I stared at it for a long time, feeling the weight of the silence. The dollhouse looked normal, but the air around it felt different. It felt heavier, like the room itself was leaning toward it. I reached out and touched the side of the dollhouse. The wood was cold, and the paint was slightly chipped. It looked old. It looked fragile. But the moment my fingers touched it, I felt something like a small shock. Not pain, just a quick, sharp awareness, as if the dollhouse had noticed me. I pulled my hand back and stepped away. The house sat in the corner, quiet and still. But I couldn't stop thinking about the way the tiny figure inside had moved. The way it had walked toward the door. The way it had seemed to be leaving, as if it was coming out of the dollhouse. I stared at the dollhouse for a long time, and then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Behind it, a shadow, a dark shape. I walked closer slowly. The dollhouse was placed against the wall, but there was a narrow gap behind it. A small space, barely wide enough for my hand. I leaned down and looked behind the dollhouse. And there it was. A mirror. Not a decorative mirror. Not a mirror that belonged in a bedroom. This mirror looked like it had been placed there on purpose. It was old, with a thin frame that was cracked in one corner. The glass was slightly foggy, as if it had been untouched for years. I stood up straight and stared at it. At first, I didn't see anything strange. Just my own reflection. My room behind me. The bed. The nightstand. The doll. But as I watched, the reflection began to shift. Slowly, like a ripple in water. The room and the mirror changed. The colors became darker. The light in the mirror dimmed. And the dollhouse in the reflection moved. It slid slightly to the side, as if something was pushing it. My heart began to race. I leaned closer. The mirror showed my room, but it wasn't my room anymore. The walls looked older. The paint was cracked. The floorboards looked worn, as if they had been walked on for decades. The dollhouse sat in the corner, but it was different too. It looked larger in the reflection, as if it had grown. I stared harder, trying to understand. Then I saw it. The front door of the mansion. Not in my room. In the mirror. The reflection showed the hallway beyond my door, the long corridor with the old portraits. But the door at the end of the hall was open. and inside the open doorway, I could see a dark room. A room that looked like a living room. And in the center of that room, there was a chair. And sitting in the chair was a person. Not a shadow. A person. Someone sitting very still, facing the mirror. The person looked like me. At least that's what I thought at first. The same shape. The same posture. The same clothes. But the face was wrong. The eyes were too dark. The skin looked pale, almost gray. And the expression was empty, like a person who had forgotten how to feel. I felt my stomach drop. I stared at the reflection, and the person in the chair lifted its head slowly. It looked directly at me, not through the mirror. At me, as if it could see me in the real room. My hands began to shake. I took a step back. The mirror showed my room, but the person in the chair remained in the reflection. Then the person stood up. It moved toward the doorway. I felt my throat tighten. The person in the reflection walked down the hallway. Slowly, carefully, as if it was being careful not to make a sound. And then it stopped. It turned its head toward the mirror, toward me, and it raised a hand. Slowly, like it was waving, or like it was reaching. I couldn't move. My body was frozen. The mirror showed the person reaching out. And then, as if the mirror itself had a pulse, the glass darkened. The reflection shifted again. The room in the mirror became clearer, brighter. The light looked natural again. But the person in the chair was still there, still staring, still waiting. And then I noticed something else. The dollhouse in the mirror was open. The front door of the dollhouse was wide. And inside, I could see tiny furniture, tiny rooms, tiny walls. And in the center of the tiny living room, there was a tiny version of me, sitting in a tiny chair. The tiny version of me looked up. It looked directly at the mirror, at me, and it smiled. A small, quiet smile. The kind of smile that makes you feel like you're not alone, but not in a good way. In a way that makes you feel like someone else is standing too close. I felt my breath catch. I stared at the mirror, unable to look away. The tiny version of me raised its hand. It waved, and then it stood up. It walked toward the tiny door, toward the tiny hallway, toward the tiny front door of the dollhouse. And then it disappeared. The mirror went dark again. For a moment, I thought it was over, that the mirror had returned to normal. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the mirror, my own reflection was still there. But my reflection was not moving. My reflection was sitting in the chair, in the dark room, in the hallway, in the mansion, and it was looking at the mirror, at me. I stared at my reflection, and I realized something that made my heart drop. The reflection was not me. Not really. The reflection looked like me, but it wasn't reacting to anything. It wasn't blinking. It wasn't breathing. It was just sitting there watching, waiting. And I knew with a sudden certainty that the mirror was not showing me the mansion. The mirror was showing me the trap. The mirror was showing me what the house wanted. The mirror was showing me the version of the mansion where I was already trapped, where I was already inside, where I was already a part of the dollhouse. I stepped back from the mirror. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely stand. I turned away from it and looked at the real room. The dollhouse sat in the corner. The doll on the nightstand watched me. The air felt heavy, and I knew in that moment that I was not safe. Not here. Not in this house. Because the house was not just a building. It was a mind. It was a trap. And it was learning how to keep me. Slowly, quietly, like the way a spider waits. Like the way a person waits. Like the way a doll waits. I looked back at the mirror one last time. The glass was clear now. My reflection was normal. My room looked normal. Everything looked normal. But I knew what I had seen. And I knew what it meant. The house was showing me a version of the future. A version where I was already inside. A version where the house had already won. And the worst part was, the reflection had not looked afraid. It had looked calm. It had looked like it belonged there. Like it was waiting for me to join it. And I realized with a slow, sinking dread that I was already too late. I didn't plan on finding the article. I was just looking for something to read. It had been a long day, and I wanted to distract myself from the quiet that had settled in my apartment. The kind of quiet that feels too big for one person to hold. I sat at my desk with a mug of tea that had gone cold, and I scrolled through old websites, just letting my eyes drift over headlines. Then I saw it. A news site I didn't recognize, the kind that looks like it hasn't been updated in years. The page was full of old stories, small town tragedies, forgotten accidents, things that people used to talk about and then never mentioned again. The headline was simple, almost bland. School closed after student VANISHES. I clicked on it without thinking. The page loaded slowly, like the internet itself was tired of showing me the past. The article was dated more than 20 years ago. The name of the school was in bold at the top, and below it was a photograph of the building. The photo was black and white, grainy, like it had been taken with an old camera. The school looked like any old building you might see in a small town. Brick walls, tall windows, a faded sign above the front entrance. It didn't look haunted. It didn't look dangerous. It just looked empty. The article said the school had been closed suddenly mid-year, after a student went missing. No body was found, no clues, no explanation. The student's name was written in the article, and for some reason, the name made my stomach tight. A girl named Emma. I don't know why it affected me. I didn't know Emma. I didn't know anyone who knew her. But I kept reading. The article described how the school staff had searched the building, the grounds, the nearby woods. The police had come. They had questioned students, parents, teachers. They had checked every locker, every hallway, every hidden corner. And then, a week later, the school was closed. The article said the town decided it was best to leave the building empty, to let it stand there like a memory, like a warning. The article ended with a quote from an old teacher. "We didn't lose her," the teacher said. "We just stopped looking." That line stayed with me long after I closed the page. I stared at my screen, feeling a strange pull. A part of me wanted to forget it, to close the laptop and go to bed. But another part of me wanted to know more. I tried to explain it to myself. Maybe it was just curiosity. Maybe it was the thrill of a mystery. Maybe it was the feeling of being drawn toward something I wasn't supposed to see. I didn't know, but I did know one thing. The article had made the school feel alive again. Like it was waiting. Like it was calling. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark for a moment. I could hear the city outside my window, cars passing, a distant siren, the hum of streetlights. And beneath all of that, I heard something else. A quiet, steady feeling in my chest. A sense that I should go. That I should see the school for myself. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't tell my friends. I didn't tell my family. I didn't even tell myself out loud. But that night, I found myself packing a small bag. A flashlight. A bottle of water. My phone. a notebook and pen. I told myself I was just going to drive out of the city and look at the building from the road, just to see it, just to satisfy the curiosity. But I knew the truth. I wanted to go inside. I wanted to see what had happened. I wanted to understand why the school had been left empty for so long. I drove out of the city late at night when the streets were quiet and the air felt cooler. The highway lights faded behind me, and the world became darker and quieter with every mile. My phone's GPS led me to a small town that looked like it had been forgotten. The buildings were old, the streets were narrow, and the only signs of life were a few dimly lit houses. The town felt sleepy, like it had been waiting for something to happen. I drove slowly, watching for the school. The GPS kept leading me toward a road that seemed to go nowhere. A narrow street lined with trees that blocked the moonlight. The kind of road that makes you feel like you're being watched, even when you know you're alone. At the end of the road, I saw it. The school. It sat behind a chain-link fence, surrounded by overgrown grass. The building was larger than I expected. The windows were dark, and the sign above the entrance was faded so badly I could barely read it. But I could still make out the name, and it made my heart beat faster. Emma. The name of the school was Emma. Not a person, a place, a school, a memory. I parked the car a short distance away, behind some trees. The gravel crunched under my tires, and the sound felt loud in the quiet night. I turned off the engine. I sat there for a moment, listening. The air was still. No wind. No animals. No sound at all. It was as if the town had stopped breathing. I grabbed my flashlight and my bag and stepped out of the car. The night air was cold, and it felt like it was pressing against my skin. I walked toward the fence. The chain link was old and rusty. The lock was still on it, but it didn't look very strong. I could have climbed over it if I wanted. But I didn't. Not yet. I stood there and stared at the building. The windows were dark, but I thought I saw something inside. A faint shape. A shadow. Like someone standing in the hallway. I shook my head and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. I looked down at the ground. There were footprints in the dirt. Fresh footprints. They led toward the fence. Toward me. I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't tell if the footprints were from someone else or if they were mine. I hadn't walked that far. I hadn't been here before. And yet, the footprints looked like they had been made recently. I took a step closer to the fence. My flashlight beam shook as I held it. I felt my heart beating hard in my chest. I felt the weight of the silence. And I felt the building watching me. I looked at the entrance. The door was closed. The windows were dark. But I could feel something inside. Something that wasn't dead. Something that was waiting. I reached out and touched the fence. The metal was cold. The rust felt rough against my fingers. And for a moment, I wondered if I should turn back. If I should go home. If I should forget the article. Forget the school. Forget the feeling that had pulled me here. But then I remembered the line from the old teacher. We didn't lose her, we just stopped looking. I thought about Emma, a student who vanished, a school that closed, a town that left the building empty. And I realized something. If the town had stopped looking, then someone else might still be looking. Someone who never stopped. Someone who didn't want to be found. I took a deep breath. I lifted my flashlight higher, and I pushed the gate open. The lock gave way with a small, tired click. The sound echoed in the night, like the building had exhaled. I stepped through, and the moment I did, the air changed. It felt colder, heavier, like the night had become thicker. And somewhere inside the school, a door creaked. Slowly, quietly, as if someone had just opened it. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the sound felt impossibly loud in the silence of the empty school. The hallway stretched ahead of me, lined with lockers whose paint had faded and chipped over the years. The floorboards beneath my feet groaned as if complaining about my intrusion. I paused for a moment, listening. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, but I could feel the building's gaze, heavy and deliberate, like it was measuring me. I turned the corner and entered the first classroom. The air hit me immediately. It smelled like chalk, dust, and old paper, a combination that should have made me nostalgic, but instead made my stomach twist. The scent was too strong, almost as if the room had been used yesterday, not 20 years ago. I swallowed hard and forced myself to step inside. The desks were arranged neatly, like the students could return at any moment. Papers were stacked on a few of them, yellowed and brittle. The blackboard at the front of the room still held faint chalk marks, smudged words that were half erased. A lesson frozen in time, abandoned in a rush. I noticed the teacher's desk near the window, and something about it made my pulse quicken. On top of the desk was a small, folded note. Fresh, crisp. Its edges weren't curled, and it didn't belong to the dust and decay surrounding it. I picked it up with trembling fingers. The paper was soft, smooth, and the handwriting was unmistakably deliberate. It read, "You shouldn't be here, but now that you are, look closer." My heart beat faster. I wanted to throw the note away to run, but the words anchored me in place. Look closer. The room demanded attention. Every shadow, every crack in the paint, every inch of dust suddenly felt significant. I shined my flashlight around the classroom, letting it linger on each detail. The chairs, the faded posters on the walls, the empty coat hooks. Nothing moved, nothing spoke. And yet the atmosphere thickened, like the building itself was exhaling around me. I walked to the blackboard, drawn to the faint chalk marks. I wiped a small section with the edge of my sleeve and uncovered letters that had been hidden beneath the dust. They formed a sentence, incomplete but chilling. She is still here. My hands froze mid-wipe. I didn't understand, and I didn't want to. But the thought of a presence, lingering all this time, made the air heavier. I felt a subtle vibration in the floor, like the building itself was pulsing under me, alive in ways I couldn't explain. I moved toward the back of the classroom, and my flashlight caught something I hadn't noticed before. A chair slightly out of line, pushed back as if someone had been sitting there recently. My pulse quickened again. I walked closer. The chair's legs scraped softly against the floor. There was no one there. The chair's shadow stretched unnaturally across the dusty floor, longer than it should have been, distorted as if the light itself hesitated to touch it. I heard it then, faint, soft, a whisper that didn't seem to belong to anyone in the room. It was a voice, almost like someone was speaking through the walls. I froze, straining to understand the words. "Don't leave me." The sound was so low, so fragile that I could have imagined it, but I didn't. My skin prickled. My breath came faster. And yet I couldn't step back. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the desk, from the note that had led me here. I circled the teacher's desk slowly, my flashlight grazing over every object. A pen, a notebook, and some scattered papers. Everything looked ordinary. But the longer I stared, the more the room seemed to shift. Shadows gathered in corners, stretching across the floor, lingering in the shape of small, indistinct figures. I felt eyes on me, tiny, observing eyes that might not belong to any human at all. My chest tightened. I told myself it was the building, the imagination. But the feeling persisted, like a heartbeat beneath my feet, waiting for me to make a move. I returned to the note. I unfolded it again, thinking maybe I had missed something. Nothing more was written, just the same words urging me to look closer. My flashlight flickered slightly, casting the shadows in odd angles. I glanced at the chalkboard again, and this time the sentence had changed slightly. She never left. I stepped back, nearly stumbling over a desk. My mind raced. Who was she, Emma, or someone else entirely? And how could a sentence change on a board that hadn't been touched in years? The room smelled stronger now, chalk, paper, and something else. Something faint, like old perfume, floral and cloying. It made the hair on my neck stand up. I moved toward the window, trying to find a rational explanation. The glass was dusty but intact. I shined my light outside. The playground was empty, silent, bathed in moonlight. No one was there. The swings didn't move. The trees didn't sway. And yet I could hear the soft shuffle of movement, like small feet padding over the floorboards above me. Not mine. Somewhere in the building, someone or something was packing. I swallowed hard and forced myself to focus on the desk again, on the note, on the blackboard, on the feeling of being watched. I realized slowly that the school wasn't just empty. It was remembering. Every sound, every object, every abandoned corner held echoes of the past, of students who had been here, of lessons that had been taught, of laughter that had turned into silence. It wasn't just a building. It was a memory, alive in a way that was nearly tangible. I stepped carefully toward the back of the classroom, letting the flashlight hover over each desk. I stopped at a small chair near the wall, its paint chipped and worn. The whisper returned, soft and urgent. "Come closer." I froze. My skin prickled, my pulse raced, but I felt drawn forward. My hand touched the desk beside the chair. The dust shifted slightly under my fingers as if acknowledging my presence. The air grew colder, heavier, and I felt a strange vertigo, like the room itself was breathing around me. I realized then that the classroom didn't want me to leave. It wanted me to see, to notice, to remember. I walked back to the teacher's desk and sat down carefully. My eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail, the faint scratches on the floor, the peeling paint, the chalk smudges, the shadowy corners. I felt a quiet pressure in the room, like the walls themselves were leaning closer, eager for me to stay. I opened my notebook and wrote down the words I had seen, the whispers I had heard. "She is still here. She never left. Come closer." The pen trembled in my hand as I wrote. I felt a presence behind me. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. The room itself seemed to breathe, shifting slightly, guiding me to understand that this was not just a building. It was a place where time had folded over itself, where the past and present merged in quiet insistence. Emma, or someone like her, had left traces here that refused to vanish. And now, so had I. I felt as though the walls were marking me, nodding my steps, cataloging my presence in the same way they had cataloged the students who came before me. Hours could have passed, or only minutes. The night outside remained still. The classroom remained the same, yet everything felt different. The air, thick with dust and memory, seemed to hum softly, carrying whispers I could almost, but not quite comprehend. Every shadow, every desk, every smudge of chalk was alive with attention, and I felt myself becoming part of it, part of the story the school refused to let go. Finally, I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. My hands still shook. My heart still raced. The building had accepted my presence, and I had accepted its reality. I didn't know how or why, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't just a visitor. I was a witness. And whatever had happened here, whatever had been lost, whatever had never left, would not allow me to walk away unchanged. The classroom smelled of chalk and old books, but it smelled alive. It smelled like a story that had waited decades to be remembered. And I knew, as I finally stood to leave, that I would return. That the school had left a door open for me, a door I could not close, even if I wanted to. I thought the bell was just a trick of my mind. I had been in the school for a while by then, and the silence had begun to feel heavy, like a thick blanket pressed against my ears. The building's stillness made every small sound feel louder. Every creak, every shift of dust, every breath I took seemed to echo through the halls. So when I heard the bell, I almost ignored it. It was a soft sound at first, like a distant church bell. Then it grew clearer, sharper, and more deliberate. It wasn't a loud clang. It wasn't a warning. It was the kind of bell you would hear in a school, the kind that calls students to class. But there was no one around. The bell rang again, a slow, steady tone that seemed to travel through the walls. It wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't coming from the street. It was inside the building, somewhere deeper than I had explored. My stomach tightened. I stood still, listening. The sound faded. Then it rang again. This time it was closer. My flashlight beam shook as I raised it, searching for the source. I moved slowly, almost carefully, as if the building itself might punish me for rushing. The hallway was dark, and the light from my flashlight created long shadows that stretched ahead of me like fingers. I followed the sound, stepping deeper into the school. The air grew colder the further I went, and the smell of chalk faded into something else, something damp and old like water that had been trapped in walls for years. I walked past classrooms, their doors closed, their windows dark. The bell rang again, closer now, and I realized it was coming from the direction of the main hall. I reached the main hall and stopped. The hall was wide, with high ceilings and tall windows. The moonlight slipped through the dirty glass, casting pale patterns on the floor. I could see the old trophy cases along the walls, their glass cloudy with age. The names inside were faded. The years were old. The whole place looked like it had been waiting for someone to remember it. The bell rang again. This time, it sounded like it was right above me. I looked up. There was a balcony at the far end of the hall, and above it was a small room that I hadn't noticed before. A bell tower, maybe. A storage room. I couldn't tell. The sound came again, and my skin prickled. It wasn't a bell swinging. It was a bell being struck. A hand, somewhere in the darkness, was striking it. I took a step toward the balcony. The floorboards creaked under my feet. The sound was loud in the empty hall. I tried to tell myself I was just following curiosity, that I was just a person who wanted to understand. But the truth was simpler and colder. I felt like I was being led, like the building was guiding me. I climbed the stairs slowly, my flashlight cutting through the dark. The air got colder with each step. I could feel my breath in front of me, fogging in the beam of light. The stairs seemed to go on forever, and I had the strange sensation that I had been here before, even though I knew I hadn't. When I reached the top, the hallway narrowed. The walls were lined with old pictures, black and white photographs of students in uniforms. Some faces were smiling, some were serious, and some looked like they were trying to hide something. I stared at them as I walked, and I felt a strange pressure behind my eyes, like the faces were watching me. The bell rang again. This time, it sounded right behind a door at the end of the hallway. The door was old, with peeling paint and a brass knob that had been polished by hands over the years. There was a small window in the door, but it was fogged with grime. I couldn't see inside. The bell rang again, and my heart beat faster. I put my hand on the knob. It was cold. I tried to turn it. It didn't budge. The door was locked. I stared at it, and for a moment I felt foolish. A locked door. That's all it was. Maybe it was just a storage room. Maybe it was a closet. Maybe it was nothing. But the bell kept ringing. Softly, patiently, as if waiting for me to do something. I stepped closer to the door and pressed my ear against it. The sound was muffled, but it was definitely coming from inside. The bell rang again, and I heard something else, a faint scraping sound like metal against wood, like someone moving something heavy, like someone trying to get out. My breath caught. I pulled back from the door. The air around me felt thick, like the hallway was holding its breath. I looked down at my flashlight. The beam flickered. For a moment, the hallway went dark. Then the light steadied, and I saw it. On the floor near the door, there was a small pile of dust, but the dust wasn't random. It was shaped like footprints, small footprints, like a child. They led to the door, and then they stopped, as if whoever made them had disappeared. I swallowed hard. I felt a chill in my bones. I looked back at the door, and the bell rang again. The sound was so close now that I could feel it in my chest. It was like the bell was inside me, ringing from the inside out. I pressed my hand against the door again, and this time I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A keyhole, an old, antique keyhole, set into the door like a mouth waiting to be fed. I stared at it and my mind filled with images. A key turning, a lock opening, a door swinging wide, a room that had been closed for years. The bell rang again and I felt something shift behind the door. A movement, a sigh, a sound like a breath. My hand trembled. I didn't know if I should leave. I didn't know if I should stay. I felt the weight of the silence pressing down on me, and I realized that the school was not just a building. It was a place that held onto things. It held onto sounds. It held onto memories. It held onto people. And the bell was a signal. A call. A reminder. I stepped back from the door and looked around the hallway. The pictures on the walls seemed to blur as if the faces were shifting. The air felt colder. The silence felt louder. The bell rang again, and I realized something that made my stomach drop. The bell wasn't ringing on its own. It was ringing for me. It was calling me to the door, to whatever was behind it. I stood there for a long moment, my flashlight beam shaking as I held it. The bell continued its slow, steady ringing. The sound echoed through the hall and seemed to fade into the walls. And then, without warning, the bell stopped. The silence returned. It was sudden, almost violent. The hallway felt empty in a way that felt unnatural. The air felt thin. I pressed my ear against the door again. Nothing. No sound. No movement. Just the faint echo of the bell, like a memory that had already faded. I took a step back. I looked at the keyhole again. And I knew, with a certainty that made my skin crawl, that the door was not meant to be opened by accident. It was meant to be opened by someone who was called, someone who had followed the sound, someone who had been drawn in, someone who had been chosen. I turned away from the door slowly, my flashlight beam trembling. I walked back down the hallway, down the stairs, and back into the main hall. The air felt heavier now, as if the building had noticed my curiosity and was adjusting to it. I stopped in the center of the hall and looked up at the balcony where the door had been. The moonlight fell on the windows, and the silence was so complete that I could hear my own breathing. The bell did not ring again, but I knew it would. And I knew that when it did, I would have to decide whether to answer. The basement was colder than the rest of the building. I didn't notice it at first. The school had already been cold and the air had felt thin. But the moment I stepped down the narrow stairs, the temperature dropped in a way that felt physical, like a hand pushing against my chest. The steps were worn and uneven, and the wood creaked under my weight. The darkness below looked deeper than it should have. I shined my flashlight down, and the beam barely reached the bottom. The light seemed to swallow itself, as if the basement was hungry. I had found the stairs by accident. I was wandering through the hallways, trying to make sense of the school's strange pull, when I noticed a door half hidden behind a hanging curtain of old bulletin boards. It was small and plain, like a service entrance. The kind of door no one thinks about because it is meant to be forgotten. But it wasn't forgotten. Not by the building. I pushed the door open and felt a rush of cold air. It smelled like damp earth and old paper. The smell made my throat tighten. I climbed down slowly. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a long corridor. The walls were lined with metal shelves, filled with boxes. The boxes were dusty, but they were neatly labeled. Each one had a year written on it, and below the year, the words student records. I stood there for a moment trying to understand what I was seeing. It looked like an archive, a place where the school kept its history. But the way the boxes were stacked, the way they were arranged, felt too careful, too deliberate. It felt like someone had been here recently. I walked down the corridor, my flashlight beam scanning the labels. The years went back decades. 1990, 1985, 1978. The air felt heavier with each step, like the building was pressing down on me, reminding me of how long it had been waiting. I reached a section labeled 1999. My heart beat faster. That was the year the article said the school closed. That was the year the student vanished. I pulled out a box labeled 1999 student records and set it on the floor. The box was heavier than it looked, like it was filled with paper that had absorbed time. I opened it carefully. The smell of old paper rose up, stronger than before. The pages were brittle. The handwriting on the forms was faded. I flipped through them slowly, as if rushing might anger the air around me. Names, dates, grades, addresses. Everything that makes a person feel real. I looked for the name mentioned in the article. Emma, the missing student, the girl who vanished. I found her file. Her picture was in the corner of the page, a small black and white school photo. She was smiling. Her hair was pulled back. She looked like any other student, the kind of smile that makes you think she belonged somewhere safe. Under her name, the record showed her attendance, her grades, her teacher. Everything seemed normal. But then I noticed something else. At the bottom of the file, there was a note written in a different handwriting, a note that looked like it had been added later. It read, "Last seen in the basement, room locked." My skin prickled. My flashlight beam trembled slightly. I read the note again. "Last seen in the basement, room locked." I felt my mind try to make sense of it. A room locked in the basement. A student last seen there. The bell calling me to a locked door. The classroom whispering to me. It all began to feel connected. I continued flipping through the box, my breath shallow. I found more names, more notes. Some were simple, some were strange, some were crossed out. Some had small, handwritten comments in the margins. I realized the notes weren't just about attendance. They were about the students themselves. There were notes like "quiet, doesn't fit in, always alone." And then one line that made my stomach twist. "Doesn't belong here." I paused. I looked at the file again. I felt a strange, cold sensation in my chest. I couldn't explain it, but the name on the file felt familiar. I flipped to the next page. And there it was. My own name. Not just my name. My full name. Written on a student record form. My face was there too. A photo, a school portrait. My hair was different, younger. The photo looked like it was taken years ago, like I had been a student in this school. But I had never been here. I had never attended this school. I had never lived in this town. I stared at the photo, my mind trying to fight the reality of what I was seeing. The smile in the picture was mine. The eyes were mine. The face was mine. And the record showed a date that made my stomach drop. A date from 20 years ago. I flipped the page again, my hands trembling. The form listed my attendance, my grades, my teachers, my address. My address. The address listed was my current apartment. My current address. I stared at the page, my eyes burning. I didn't know what to feel. Fear, confusion, anger. It was all mixed together in a tight knot in my chest. The air in the basement felt even colder now, like the building had noticed my reaction and was responding to it. I looked closer at the record. There was a note at the bottom, written in the same different handwriting as the one on Emma's file. It said, "Last seen in the basement, room locked." The same note. The same words. My heart hammered. I took a step back from the box. The basement seemed to grow darker, as if the light from my flashlight was being swallowed. I looked down the corridor. The shelves stretched into the darkness. The boxes were stacked neatly, like the school had been preparing for someone to come back. Someone like me. Someone who was supposed to be here. I held my flashlight tighter. My breath came faster. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone had put my name there as a prank. Maybe the school records had been altered. Maybe it was a coincidence. But the feeling in my chest told me otherwise. It told me the truth. I had been here before. Or I was meant to be here. The idea made my stomach turn. I walked back to the shelves and pulled out another box. The label read 1998 student records. I opened it, and my flashlight beam fell on a page that made my blood run cold. There was a photo of a young girl standing in front of the school. She was holding a small doll. Her face was serious, almost sad. And written on the back of the photo, in neat handwriting, was a name. Emma. I turned the photo over again, looking for more notes. There was a date that matched the day the school closed. And below it, a sentence written in the same different handwriting. She never left. I stared at the words and I felt something in my mind shift. The school wasn't just a building that held memories. It was a place that kept people. It kept their names, their records, their faces, their stories. And now it had my name too. I felt my breath catch. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave. To run. To get out of the basement and out of the building, and back to the world where things made sense. But I couldn't move. I was frozen. Not because I was afraid of the dark, but because I realized something else. The records weren't just files. They were proof. Proof that the school had not forgotten. Proof that the school had been keeping track of people who disappeared. Proof that the building had been collecting names. And now it had collected mine. I backed away from the box, my flashlight shaking. The air felt thicker, as if the basement was closing in around me. I turned and started to walk toward the stairs. But before I could take a step, I heard a sound behind me. A soft rustle, like paper moving, like someone flipping through a file. I froze. My flashlight beam swung slowly, searching the darkness. The shelves stood still. The boxes remained stacked. But I could feel something watching me. Something that didn't want me to leave. Something that wanted me to stay. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move. I walked up the stairs slowly, as if each step might be the last safe one I took. The air grew warmer as I climbed. The smell of chalk returned. The smell of old books. When I reached the top, I turned back one last time. The basement door was closed, but I could still feel the weight of the records. The weight of my name. And the feeling that the school had been waiting for me. Waiting for someone to notice. Waiting for someone to remember. I stepped into the hallway and shut the door behind me. The building was quiet again, but the quiet felt different now. It felt full. Full of names. Full of stories. Full of people who had never left. And I realized, with a dread that made my hands cold, that I might not be the first person to find the records. I might not be the first person to see my own name. I might not be the first person to be called. I didn't believe them at first. Not really. When I moved into the neighborhood, I told myself I was just tired. I told myself the warnings were just small-town superstition. I told myself people like to talk about strange things when they don't have much else to say. But the first time someone said it, I felt a chill I couldn't explain. It was the old man next door. He had lived there for as long as anyone could remember. His yard was always perfectly trimmed, his porch light always on, and his eyes always watching. He came over the day I moved in, carrying a small box of cookies as a welcome gesture. I thanked him and introduced myself. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Then he said it. "Be careful in that house," he told me. "It never sleeps." I laughed softly, trying to make it sound like a joke. Sure, I said, like the house is haunted. The old man didn't laugh. He just stared at me for a long moment, like he was trying to decide whether I was the kind of person who needed to be warned. Then he said quietly, "You'll see." I thought that was the end of it. I thought it was just a weird thing an old man said. But it was. The next day, a woman on the street waved at me and asked if I needed help carrying anything inside. I thanked her, and she smiled kindly. Then she paused, and her smile faded. "You moved into the house on the corner," she said. "Yes," I replied. She looked down at the ground and spoke slowly. "You know the house never sleeps, right?" I felt my skin prickling. I tried to laugh again, but it came out weak. "I've heard that," I said, "but it's just a story, right?" The woman shook her head. "No, it's not a story, it's something else." She looked at me with a kind of sadness, like she didn't want to be the one to tell me. Then she said, "Don't stay up late, don't listen for it, and don't go into the attic." The word attic made my heart beat a little faster. "Why?" I asked. The woman hesitated. Then she said, "Because it will notice you." Notice you. The word sat in my mind like a stone. I thanked her again, and she walked away. I went inside my new house and tried to shake it off. I told myself the neighborhood was just full of old stories. People always had something to say about old houses. People always had warnings when they didn't want to admit the truth. But as I unpacked, I found myself glancing at the corners of the rooms. I found myself listening for sounds that weren't there. I found myself wondering if the house really was awake. The house was old, but not in a creepy way. It was the kind of old that had been cared for. The kind of old that had been renovated and painted and cleaned. The kind of old that looked warm in daylight. But at night, it felt different. At night, the house felt like it had a pulse. I slept poorly the first night. I told myself it was just the stress of moving. I told myself the creaks and groans were normal for old houses. I told myself I was imagining things. But when I woke up, I found something that made my stomach drop. On my nightstand, there was a small note. It wasn't there when I went to bed. It wasn't something I had written. It was written in neat handwriting, the kind of handwriting that looks calm and steady, even when the words are strange. The note said, "Welcome home." I stared at it for a long time. My mind tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe I had dropped it. Maybe someone had left it as a prank. Maybe the old man next door had a sense of humor. But the note felt too personal, too deliberate. I felt like the house had left it for me. I folded the note carefully and put it in my pocket. I didn't want to leave it out where someone else might see it. I didn't want to give it more power. I went about my day trying to act normal. I unpacked more boxes. I cleaned the kitchen. I set up my desk. I tried to pretend I wasn't thinking about the warnings. But the house seemed to notice my thoughts. Every time I walked through a room, the air felt slightly colder. Every time I sat down, I felt like someone was sitting behind me. Every time I looked at a doorway, I felt like something was waiting on the other side. That night, I decided to sleep early. I told myself I would prove to myself that the house was just a house, that the warnings were just stories. I went to bed and closed my eyes. For a while, I heard nothing. Then at around midnight, I heard a sound. A soft, slow sound, like something moving in the walls. I sat up, my heart beating fast. The sound stopped. I listened. Nothing. I lay back down and tried to breathe slowly. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself it was just the house settling. I told myself it was nothing. Then the sound started again. This time it was closer. It was a faint tapping, like nails on wood, like someone tapping from the inside. I held my breath. The tapping continued, slow and steady. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't loud. It wasn't scary in a jump scare way. It was just there, like the house was trying to communicate. I sat up again and listened. The tapping seemed to move around the room like someone walking along the walls. It was soft, but it made my skin crawl. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the tapping stopped. The room was quiet again. But the silence felt different now. It felt attentive. I lay back down, my eyes open, staring at the ceiling. I tried to convince myself to sleep. I tried to convince myself that the house was just making noises. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching me. That it was waiting. That it never truly slept. In the morning, I went outside and walked around the neighborhood. I wanted to talk to someone. I wanted to hear a rational explanation. I wanted to hear something that would make me feel safe again. But the neighbors were quiet. They smiled when they saw me, but they avoided eye contact. They spoke in short sentences, like they didn't want to draw attention to themselves. I walked past the old man's house. He was on his porch watching the street. He looked up as I approached. "How was your first night?" he asked. I hesitated. I didn't know what to say. "It was fine," I lied. The old man nodded slowly, as if he knew I was lying. Then he said, "It will get worse." I swallowed hard. "Why?" I asked. He looked at me with a strange expression, like he was trying to decide how much to tell me. Then he said, "Because it wants you to know it's awake." I felt a chill run through me. I didn't know what he meant. I didn't know what the house wanted. But I knew one thing with certainty. The warnings were real. The house never slept. And now it had my attention. That night I didn't sleep at all. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe. I tried to tell myself I was safe. I tried to tell myself it was just an old building. But the house felt alive. And it felt like it was waiting for me to notice. I stayed awake on purpose. Not because I was brave. Because I needed proof. I needed to know if the house was just an old building making old noises, or if there was something more in the walls, something that didn't belong. I told myself that if I could stay awake, I could catch the moment the house woke up. I could see it for what it was. I could prove the neighbors wrong. I set up a small station in the living room. A lamp, a glass of water, my phone, and a notebook. I told myself I would write down everything I heard, every creak, every whisper of the floorboards, every strange sound. I sat on the couch and stared at the clock. It was 10:00 p.m. I told myself I would stay awake until 2:00 a.m. That seemed reasonable, long enough to prove a point, but not so long that I would be exhausted the next day. I turned on the lamp but kept the lights dim. I wanted to keep the atmosphere calm. I didn't want to feel like I was in a haunted house. I told myself I was just watching. I told myself I was just observing. The first hour passed slowly. The house made its normal sounds, the kind of sounds that old houses make. The pipes settling, the wood contracting, the soft creak of the floor when the wind shifted outside. I wrote it all down. I tried to keep my mind busy. I tried to stay calm. I told myself that if I wrote everything down, I would feel less afraid. But the longer I stayed awake, the more I noticed things I hadn't noticed before. The way the house seemed to breathe. The way the shadows moved in the corners. The way the air felt slightly heavier near the hallway. At 11:30 p.m., I heard a sound that made my stomach tighten. It was the sound of a door closing. Not the front door. Not a closet. It was a door inside the house. The sound was soft, but it carried through the quiet. I froze. I waited. Nothing else happened. No footsteps. No movement. Just silence. I told myself it was nothing. maybe the wind, maybe the house shifting. But my heart was racing. I stared at the hallway. The hallway led to the bedrooms. It led to the kitchen. It led to the stairs. I could see the outline of the stairs in the dim light. The house felt larger than it should have, like it had more rooms than it actually did. I kept staring. Then, at 11:59 p.m., the house changed. It was subtle at first, like the air had been gently rearranged. The lamp light seemed dimmer, the shadows seemed deeper, the silence felt different. Then the clock hit midnight, and everything shifted. The house felt like it exhaled, a slow, heavy breath. The temperature dropped. The air became thick, like a curtain had been drawn over the room. I felt a pressure in my chest, like the house was pressing down on me. I stared at the clock. 12:00 a.m. The minute hand moved. The second hand clicked forward, and the house became awake. The sound started. Not the normal sounds. Different. Like something moving through the walls. Like something shifting in the floors. The creaks were louder now. The floorboards seemed to stretch. The air felt charged. It was as if the house had been holding its breath, waiting for midnight. Now it was finally free to move. I sat very still. My body felt frozen. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I didn't want to do anything that might make the house notice me. But the house noticed me anyway. The sound of footsteps came from upstairs. Slow, deliberate, not the light, careful steps of a person trying to be quiet. The heavy steps of something that didn't care if it was heard. I listened. My mind tried to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was the old pipes again. Maybe it was a loose board. Maybe a raccoon in the attic. But the footsteps were too steady, too human, too purposeful. I swallowed hard. The steps stopped. I held my breath. Then the sound of something dragging came from the hallway. A soft scraping noise, like a chair being moved across the floor. My heart was pounding now. I could feel the blood in my ears. The house felt like it was closing in. The air felt thick with attention. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to run. But I didn't. I was trapped in my own body. The dragging sound continued. It moved closer. It moved toward the living room. I stared at the hallway. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. I could feel the presence. The dragging stopped right at the edge of the living room. Then there was a pause. A long pause. Like whatever was, there was listening. Like it was waiting for me to react. I didn't. I stayed perfectly still. My eyes were wide. My mind was racing. I didn't know what to do. Then the air in the room changed again. The lamp flickered. Just once. Like a breath. Then it steadied. The light returned, but the shadows seemed different. They were deeper. They were more defined. The room looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. I felt like I was being watched. I looked toward the hallway again. I saw something move. A shadow. A shape. Not a full person. Not a clear outline. Just a dark shape that didn't belong. It moved slowly. It seemed to glide. It didn't have feet. It didn't have a face. But it moved with intention. It moved toward the couch. I felt my body tense. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. The shape stopped at the edge of the couch. And then it leaned in, as if it was looking at me. I felt the weight of its attention, like a hand resting on my shoulder, like a cold breath near my ear. Then it moved away. slowly, back into the hallway. I watched it disappear. My chest heaved. I didn't know if I was breathing. The house was quiet again, but the silence was different now. It was not peaceful. It was waiting. It was listening. I looked at the clock. 12:17 a.m. I felt like I had been awake for hours, but I had only been awake for a short time. Time felt wrong in the house. The minutes felt longer. The air felt heavier. The house felt like it was stretching time. I stayed on the couch, unable to move. I stared at the hallway. I waited. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I knew I couldn't leave. I knew I couldn't run, because the house would notice, and I didn't know what would happen if it noticed. The night went on. The house made small sounds. A whisper of movement. A soft tap. A faint creak. Like something was walking around, checking the rooms, checking the corners, checking the walls, checking the house itself. It felt like the house was alive, like it was caring for something, like it was looking for something. I kept thinking about the neighbors' warnings. The house never sleeps. What did that mean? Did it mean the house was haunted? Did it mean the house was alive? Or did it mean something else? As the night dragged on, I began to understand something. The house wasn't haunted in the way people think. It wasn't filled with ghosts. It wasn't a place where spirits floated around. It was something different. It was a place that watched. A place that waited. A place that collected. And it did it at night. When the clock hit midnight. When the house woke up. When the world outside was asleep. When it could move without being seen. I don't know how long I sat there. Hours maybe. Or maybe it was only minutes. Time didn't feel real anymore. But I remember the moment the sun started to rise. The house began to change again. The air became lighter. The shadows softened. The heavy feeling lifted. It was like the house was falling back asleep. The house was returning to its daytime form. The house was returning to being a normal house. I felt my body relax. My mind felt like it was coming back. I stood up slowly. My legs felt weak. I walked to the front door. I opened it. The outside air felt like a relief. Like I had been underwater and finally broke the surface. I stepped outside and looked back at the house. It looked ordinary again. The sun was rising. The neighborhood was waking up. Birds were singing. People were moving about. Everything looked normal. But I knew it was. I knew the house had changed. I knew it had woken up. And I knew it would do it again. That night, I tried to convince myself it was a one-time thing. That maybe I had imagined it. That maybe I had been tired. That maybe the house had just been strange. But I knew the truth. The house never slept. And now I knew when it woke up. At midnight. Every night. And I didn't know if I was going to be able to stay awake forever. Because the house was watching. And it was waiting. I found the hallway by accident. I was not looking for it. I was not trying to find anything else in the house. I was simply walking from the living room to the kitchen, still shaken from the night before, when I noticed the air felt colder than usual. The light was dimmer. The wallpaper looked older, as if it had been painted over too many times. And there it was. A narrow corridor I had never seen before. It wasn't on any floor plan. It wasn't behind any door I remembered. It wasn't even in the same place as the hallway I had walked through earlier that day. It was new. Or maybe it had always been there, and I had never noticed because the house didn't want me to. I stood at the entrance for a long time, staring down the corridor. The walls were lined with old wood paneling. The floorboards looked worn. The ceiling was low and the light was weak. The air smelled like dust and something else I couldn't place. Something metallic, like a penny left in a pocket too long. I could feel my skin prickle. My heart started to beat faster. I told myself to go back. I told myself it was a mistake. But I couldn't turn away. I stepped forward. The hallway stretched out before me like a line drawn into infinity. The more I walked, the more it seemed to go on. At first, I thought it was a trick of perspective. Maybe the hallway was just long, and my eyes were playing a game. But after a few minutes, I realized something else. The hallway wasn't ending. It wasn't bending. It was simply endless. There were doors on both sides, spaced evenly apart. Each door looked slightly different. Some were painted, some were bare wood. Some had brass knobs, some had old iron handles. Some were cracked, some were perfectly intact. I reached out and touched the first door. It was cold. The wood felt like it had been chilled for hours. I backed away slowly. I didn't want to touch anymore. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know what was behind them. The first door opened easily. No creak. No resistance. Just a quiet slide, like a secret being revealed. I stepped inside. The room was dark but not pitch black. A faint light glowed from somewhere in the distance. I could hear a sound. A soft rhythmic sound. Like someone breathing. Like someone crying. The air was thick. The walls were close. I felt trapped. I realized with a sudden shock that the room was not empty. There was a figure in the corner. A person. Or something like a person. I couldn't see their face clearly. The light was too dim. But I could see the outline of their body. They were sitting on the floor, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around themselves. Their head was down. Their hair was long and dark. They looked like they had been there for a long time. I felt a strange pull in my chest. A feeling of deep sadness. A feeling of fear. I stepped closer. The figure lifted their head, and I saw their eyes. They were wide, hollow, filled with a kind of empty terror. I felt my stomach twist. The figure whispered something. I couldn't hear the words, but the sound was clear. It was a voice I recognized. Not from this house. Not from any person I knew. It was a voice from my own memories. A voice from my childhood. A voice I hadn't heard in years. I stood frozen. The figure's lips moved again, and the air around me changed. The room shifted. The walls seemed to close in. The floor felt like it was tilting. I stumbled backward. I slammed the door shut. My hands shook. I pressed my back against the door and tried to breathe. My mind was racing. I didn't understand what I had just seen, but I knew it wasn't real. Or maybe it was too real. I looked at the hallway again. The doors were still there. The corridor still stretched on. My heart was pounding. I felt like I had just looked into a mirror and seen something I wasn't supposed to see. I took a step forward. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I told myself the room was a trick, a dream, a hallucination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had shown me something on purpose. I opened the next door. The second room was different. It was brighter. It looked like a classroom. Old desks lined up in rows. A chalkboard on the wall. The air smelled like chalk and dust. I walked inside. The room felt familiar. Like I had been there before. Like I had lived in this place at some point. I looked at the chalkboard. There were words written in neat handwriting. The words were not in English. They were in a language I didn't recognize. But the letters looked like they were written by someone who had been writing for a long time. Someone who had practiced. Someone who had repeated the same words over and over. I heard a sound behind me. I turned. A child was standing in the doorway. A boy. He looked about 8 years old. He had messy hair. His clothes were old-fashioned. He stared at me with wide eyes. His face was pale. His lips were trembling. He didn't speak. He just stared. I felt my throat tighten. I tried to say something, but my voice didn't work. The boy stepped closer. His eyes were fixed on me. He reached out his hand. I stepped back. The boy's expression changed. His face twisted into something I couldn't describe. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was hunger. He wanted something from me. He wanted something I couldn't give. He opened his mouth. He whispered my name. My real name. The name I had not told anyone in years. The name I had tried to forget. The name that only I knew. My breath caught. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. The boy's hand reached toward me again. I stumbled backward, nearly falling. I slammed the door shut again. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the knob. I pressed my forehead against the wood. I felt like I was going to be sick. I had seen 2 rooms now. 2 nightmares. 2 pieces of someone else's fear. And I realized something. The hallway was not just a hallway. It was a collection. A corridor of nightmares. A place where the house stored the worst parts of people's minds. A place where the house kept the things people feared most. I took a deep breath. I tried to steady myself. I tried to think. I tried to understand. And then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The hallway was changing. The doors were shifting. They were moving slightly, like they were breathing. The walls were tightening. The air was thickening. And the doors, they were getting closer. The corridor was narrowing. It felt like the hallway was pulling me deeper. Like it wanted me to keep walking. Like it wanted me to open more doors. Like it wanted me to stay. I took a step back. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. The hallway felt like it had a grip on me. I could feel the fear in my chest growing. I could feel it rising. I could feel the way the house was feeding on it. The house wasn't haunted. Not in the way people think. It wasn't filled with ghosts. It was filled with fear. It was filled with the worst parts of people's minds. And it was hungry. I realized then what the neighbors had meant. The house never sleeps. It wasn't because the house was alive. It was because the house was always feeding. Always collecting. Always waiting for someone to bring their fear inside. And now I had brought mine. I had opened the door. I had stepped into the corridor. I had let the house see me. I had let the house taste my fear. I could feel it. Like a presence behind me. Like a cold breath on my neck. I turned slowly. The hallway was behind me. It stretched on, dark and endless. The doors were still there. The nightmares were still waiting. And in the distance, I heard something. A soft sound. Like a bell. A bell ringing in the darkness. The sound made my skin crawl. It felt like a signal. Like the house was calling out. Like it was inviting me to continue. To open another door. To feed it more. I didn't move. I stood there frozen. My mind was racing. My body was shaking. And I realized the worst part of all of this. The house wasn't just feeding on fear. It was using it. It was using the nightmares to trap people, to keep them inside, to make them stay, to make them forget the way out. The hallway was endless for a reason. It wasn't meant to be walked. It was meant to be lost in. And I was already lost. I took one last look at the corridor. I looked at the doors. I looked at the darkness. I looked at the endless stretch of hallway. And I understood. The house didn't need ghosts. It didn't need spirits. It only needed us. Our fear, our memories, our nightmares, because that was what it lived on. That was what it fed on. And now I was part of it.